Nobody wanted her. Everyone watched. Then the barn doors flew open, and nothing in Silver Hollow was ever the same again. She stood in the middle of that barn like a woman waiting to be sentenced, and maybe she was. 24 years old, dress mended twice at the hem, hands that knew more about hard work than any man in that room would ever admit. One by one, they walked past her. Some didn't even slow down. The whispers crawled along the walls like smoke. Eleanor Cross, the disgraced man's daughter, the poor one. She kept her chin up, barely. And then the doors burst open. And in walked the one man nobody expected. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far these mountains can reach. Hit that like button and stay with Eleanor until the very last word. You won't regret it. The cold came in under the barn doors the way cold always did in Silver Hollow. Not all at once, but slowly, creeping along the straw-covered floor like it had somewhere to be and wasn't in any particular hurry to get there. Eleanor Cross felt it first in her ankles, then up through the thin soles of her good shoes, the ones she only wore twice a year, Easter and the spring gathering. And she thought, not for the first time that evening, that she should have worn 2 pairs of stockings. But she hadn't known. She hadn't known a lot of things when she'd agreed to come tonight. The Harlan barn sat at the eastern edge of town, big enough to hold half of Silver Hollow on a good night, which is exactly what it was doing. Lanterns hung from the rafters on iron hooks, throwing orange light over the scrubbed plank floors. Someone had dragged in a fiddle player from 2 towns over, and he was working his way through something cheerful that nobody was particularly listening to. Tables along the south wall held enough food to make Eleanor's stomach tighten in a way she hadn't expected. Cornbread still steaming, a whole roasted pig, pies lined up in a row like soldiers. She hadn't eaten much that day. She tried not to think about that. The spring matchmaking gathering was Silver Hollow's oldest tradition and its most quietly brutal one. It wasn't called a matchmaking gathering, of course. Officially, it was the spring social, which sounded harmless, something you might look forward to. But everyone in the territory knew what it was. Families brought their unmarried daughters. Men of means, ranchers, merchants, the occasional successful prospector came to look. Conversations happened. Arrangements were made. Girls left with prospects, or they left without them. And the town spent the following week discussing which was which and why. Eleanor had come because Martha Gaines had talked her into it. "You can't hide forever," Martha had said, standing in the doorway of Eleanor's small house on the edge of town. Her expression caught somewhere between pity and the particular kind of encouragement that people deploy when they think a situation is hopeless but feel obligated to try anyway. "You're 24 years old. You're not ugly. You're smart as anyone I know. Come to the social." "Martha, your father has been dead 3 years. Martha's voice dropped, not unkindly. "At some point, the town has to move on. At some point, you have to move on." Eleanor had wanted to ask which town Martha was referring to, because it didn't appear to be the same Silver Hollow she'd been living in. But she'd come anyway. Because Martha wasn't entirely wrong. Because the winter had been the longest she could remember, spent mostly alone in that cold house with her needlework and her accounts, and the particular silence of a woman who has stopped expecting much from the world. Because some stubborn piece of her, the piece her mother used to call her good-bad quality, refused to accept that this was all there was going to be. She'd worn the blue dress. She'd done her hair carefully. She'd walked into the Harlan barn with her shoulders straight and her expression composed, and for approximately the first 20 minutes, she'd even let herself believe that maybe this time would be different. It was not different. The first man was Clarence Webb, who ran the feed store and had recently become a widower. He was 43 and had the look of a man who had spent a great deal of time being disappointed in things. He approached Eleanor with what seemed like genuine intention, asked her name, heard it, and then something shifted behind his eyes. A quick recalibration, like a man who has reached for something on a shelf and realized at the last moment it wasn't what he thought it was. "Miss Cross," he said, "I knew your father." "Most people in Silver Hollow did," Eleanor said. "Yes." He paused, looked at her in a way that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the dead man's reputation. "Well, I expect I'll get myself some of that cornbread." He never came back. The second man, Thomas Aldrich, a young rancher from the valley, was at least honest. He didn't even finish crossing the room. He got close enough to catch someone else's eye. Someone who stage whispered, "That's Henry Cross's daughter." And Thomas Aldrich turned on his heel and went to talk to the Beaumont girls, who were giggling near the punch bowl in a way that suggested they were aware they were being watched and enjoyed it. Eleanor watched this happen from 6 feet away. She kept her face very still. The third man, whose name she never caught, shook her hand and then immediately asked her who her father was and how he'd died, and whether it was true that Henry Cross had owed money to half the territory before the end. "He owed money to about a quarter of it," Eleanor said. "I paid back what I could. The rest they were kind enough to forgive." The man nodded like this confirmed something he'd suspected. Then he wandered off to find a drink. By the time the fourth man declined to approach her at all, she watched him assess her from across the room and simply decide. She could see him decide. Eleanor had reached a particular kind of stillness inside herself. Not peace. Nothing as clean as peace. It was more like the absence of surprise. Like she had known this was coming and had come anyway and now was being proven right and didn't have the energy left to be angry about it. She was standing near the east wall, not far from the food tables, close enough that she had a reason to be there, but not so close that she was obviously waiting for anyone. She had a small plate of cornbread that she was eating slowly, mechanically, not tasting it. Across the room, she could see Martha Gaines watching her with an expression that Eleanor was too tired to interpret. She looked away. The fiddle player had shifted to something slower, which didn't help the general atmosphere. "Bet she's hoping one of them has bad eyesight." The voice was low, a woman's voice, not trying particularly hard to be quiet. Eleanor didn't turn to look. She knew without turning that it was Dorothy Marsh, who had been Dorothy Calhoun before she married Wells 7 years ago, and who had been one of Eleanor's close friends in the years before everything, and who had not spoken to her since. "Her father died owing my uncle $60, another voice said. "Ran off with half the mining company's reserves first. Whole family's rotten." "The mother was decent enough," a third voice offered. "Mother's been dead 4 years. A pause. "Still, can't blame the men for being cautious." Eleanor ate a bite of cornbread. It tasted like sawdust. She chewed it anyway. Cautious. That was one word for it. What her father had done was not a simple story, but the town had made it simple, the way towns always do. Henry Cross had been a charming, ambitious, fundamentally flawed man who had convinced a small group of investors to put money into a silver mine that turned out to be worth approximately nothing. Whether he had known it was worthless before he took their money was a question that had never been fully settled. But Silver Hollow had settled it anyway, the way Silver Hollow settled most things, quickly, and in the direction that made the best story. Fraud, they called it. Swindler. Never mind that Henry Cross had also believed in that mine, had spent his own savings on it first, had died 2 years later of pneumonia in a house so cold he'd burned the furniture for heat. Never mind any of that. The story had its shape, and Eleanor was part of its shape, and no amount of honest work or careful living or debt repayment had managed to change that. She was the swindler's daughter. She would probably die the swindler's daughter. She set her plate down on the table next to her because she wasn't hungry anymore. "Excuse me." She turned. The woman beside her was Agnes Porter, who had been on the town council's wives committee for as long as Eleanor could remember. A compact woman of about 50, with a permanently sympathetic expression that never quite reached her eyes. "Eleanor, dear," Agnes said, "I think perhaps it would be kinder—" She stopped, reconsidered her phrasing. "It might be easier for everyone if I left," Eleanor said. Agnes blinked. "I was going to say if you perhaps found somewhere more comfortable to—" "You were going to suggest I leave, Mrs. Porter." A pause. A flush climbing Agnes Porter's neck. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant." Eleanor's voice was even. She'd had a great deal of practice keeping her voice even. "Thank you for the suggestion." She turned away from Agnes Porter and faced the room. This was the moment she would remember later, turning it over and over in her mind like a stone she couldn't put down. The room full of people who had known her since childhood, the fiddle player sawing through his slow tune, the lantern light making everyone look golden and warm when nothing in the room was particularly warm. The couples forming up in the way they always did at these things, the easy gravitational pull of mutual approval, of people finding their place. She didn't have a place. She had known that for years, really. But there is a difference between knowing something in the abstract and being confronted with it in a barn full of people who have collectively, quietly, without malice or drama, simply excluded you from the normal human commerce of belonging. Eleanor Cross was 24 years old, and she was done. Not dramatically, not in the way of a woman who sweeps out of a room. Just done. The way a fire goes out when the wood is gone. Not with fury, but with a quiet exhaustion that left very little behind. She was reaching for her coat on the hook by the side wall when the barn doors opened. Not the small door on the east side that people used to come and go. The main doors. Both of them. The cold hit the room like a fist. Lantern flames jumped sideways. Several women gasped. The fiddle player stopped mid-note, and Gideon Wolfe walked in from the dark. Eleanor would later try to describe what happened in the room when Gideon Wolfe appeared, and she would always fail because the sensation defied straightforward description. It wasn't silence. People kept making sounds, small sounds, sharp intakes of breath, the rustle of skirts as women turned. It was more like a change in the quality of attention, like the room had been a room and then suddenly was a different kind of room. He was bigger than she'd expected, and she'd expected big. The stories about Gideon Wolfe circulated through Silver Hollow and the surrounding territory the way stories about certain men always do, with a mixture of reverence and unease, embellishment piled on embellishment, until the actual man, whoever he was, had been buried under his own legend. She'd heard he was 6.5 feet tall. She'd heard he'd killed a grizzly with nothing but a hunting knife. She'd heard he'd once trapped so much beaver in a single season that he'd had to hire 4 men just to haul the pelts down to Creed. The first 2 were probably exaggeration. The third one, she would later learn, was completely true. He was not 6.5 feet tall. He was perhaps 6'2", 6'3", broad through the shoulders in a way that the heavy fur coat he wore only emphasized. Dark hair, a few weeks past needing a cut, pushed back from a face that was strongly made. Not handsome in any conventional sense, but the kind of face that made you keep looking at it, the way you keep looking at mountain ridgelines, something structural and unapologetic about the shape of it, a jaw that needed a shave, eyes that, from across the room, even from this distance, were the particular dark amber of river water over stone. He was 30, maybe 32. He looked older in the way that men who spend their lives outdoors often do, weather-worked, the lines around his eyes deep from years of squinting against wind and snow and sun. He stopped just inside the doors and looked at the room. Didn't say anything, didn't appear particularly concerned by the 30-odd people staring at him. He was wearing snow on his shoulders and mud on his boots, and he didn't seem aware of either. "Wolf," someone said. Tom Beaumont, Eleanor thought, one of the larger ranchers standing near the center of the room, with the easy authority of a man who is accustomed to rooms organizing themselves around him. "Didn't expect to see you at something like this." "I heard there was a gathering." Gideon Wolfe's voice was low, not quiet exactly, it carried without effort, but low, like the bottom register of a sound that was mostly felt rather than heard. "I had business in town." "Business," Tom Beaumont said, with the slight emphasis that suggested he found this amusing. "This is a social, Wolf, for families, for—" He gestured vaguely at the room, meaning the daughters, the arrangements, the whole careful machinery of it. "I know what it is," Gideon Wolfe said. He looked at the room again. A slower look this time, more deliberate. His eyes moved across the gathered crowd with the attentiveness of a man who scans terrain, not rudely, not with the aggressive assessment of someone trying to make a point, but with a kind of practical focus, like he was looking for something specific. The Beaumont girls had arranged themselves more attractively. Clara Webb, who was 17 and generally considered the prettiest girl in 3 counties, had straightened up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Margaret Foster had developed a sudden interest in standing in better light. These things happened automatically, unconsciously, the way women's bodies respond to the presence of a man with resources and an air of consequence. Gideon Wolfe's gaze moved past all of them. It stopped on Eleanor Cross. She had her coat half on, one arm through the sleeve, one still hanging. She was standing by the sidewall next to the hook where the coats were kept, which meant she was not in the center of the room, not in a good light, not positioned in any way that would suggest she was expecting attention. She had been in the act of leaving. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked toward her. The room noticed. Eleanor noticed the room noticing, which was somehow worse. The collective swivel of attention following him across the barn floor, the murmur that rose and then quieted. She stood very still and kept her expression the same as it had been, which was the expression of a woman who has decided not to feel anything she isn't absolutely required to feel. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the details of him. The cold that still clung to his coat, the careful stitching on the fur collar, the particular quality of his attention, which was complete and direct and a little unsettling. "You're Eleanor Cross," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "I'm Gideon Wolfe. I know who you are." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. His face didn't seem to do smiles easily, but a slight easing around the eyes. "Do you?" It wasn't a question either. "Everyone in the territory knows who you are," Eleanor said. She was aware of the entire room watching them. She found that she couldn't quite make herself care about that right now, which was interesting. "You're the man who trapped more fur than anyone in the High Rockies for the last 6 years. You came down to Creede in November with a wagon full of pelts and bought the Hargrove land outright. People have been talking about it all winter." "People talk a lot in this town," he said. "They do," she agreed. A pause. He was studying her in that way of his, that particular quality of attention that she was already starting to understand was simply how he looked at things, fully, without the social courtesy of pretending he wasn't. "You were leaving," he said. "I was." "Why?" She almost laughed. Almost. She swallowed it. "I think you probably know why, Mr. Wolfe. Unless you missed the last 2 hours. "I got here 20 minutes ago," he said. "I was outside long enough to get the shape of things." "Then you know why." He considered this. "What are you planning to do after tonight?" Eleanor blinked. It was such an unexpected question. Not where are you going, or do you have family elsewhere, or any of the things a person might reasonably ask. But what are you planning to do? As if the immediate future was the only relevant territory. "Go home," she said. "Get up tomorrow. Work." She paused. "Same as most days." "What kind of work?" "Sewing. Some bookkeeping for the merchant on Main Street, enough to get by." "You've been getting by for how long?" She looked at him. 3 years, since my father died." "Alone?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, like this answered something he'd been working out. "I need someone for the homestead," he said. His voice was matter-of-fact, the same tone he might have used to discuss the price of timber. "It's a proper homestead. I've been building it for 4 years. It's established. It can support 2 people without strain. Better than 2, actually. There's more work than I can handle alone, and I'm gone for months at a stretch trapping. Things fall behind." Eleanor stared at him. "I'm not talking about charity," he continued, before she could speak. "I'm talking about a working arrangement. You'd have your own space, your own room. In return, you manage the homestead when I'm away, and we share the work when I'm there." He paused. "It's high up, isolated. The winters are harder than anything you'll find down here." The room was so quiet now that the fiddle player had simply stopped playing and was watching along with everyone else. "Mr. Wolfe," Eleanor said carefully, "you don't know me." "I know enough." "You've been in town 20 minutes. I've been asking about you since November," he said. Something in his voice shifted. Not softer exactly, but more direct. "When I bought the Hargrove land and decided to establish the homestead properly, I started asking around about who in this territory worked hard and kept their word. Your name came up more than once, not with praise." He said this without any particular delicacy, just the flat statement of it. "Most people said it with a qualifier. She's hardworking, but—" A brief pause. "She's capable, but—" "Always something about your father." Eleanor said nothing. "I don't care about your father," Gideon Wolfe said. The words landed in the quiet barn with a weight that the room seemed to physically register. She saw Dorothy Marsh's head turn. She saw Agnes Porter's expression go through several things quickly. "I care about whether a person can work," he continued, "and whether they'll stay when things get hard. Based on what I've heard, you've been staying through hard things for 3 years without anyone's help." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Her heart was doing something strange and uneven in her chest, but her face was still. She'd learned to keep her face still a long time ago. "You're asking me to come and live in the mountains with you," she said. "A man I've never met." "Yes." Most people would say that's an insane thing to do. Most people say a lot of things. He glanced briefly at the room around them. A single, level glance that somehow managed to take in the whole of it. The watching faces, the suspended judgment, all of it. Then his eyes came back to her. "I'm not most people." Eleanor Cross looked at this man standing in front of her in a barn that had spent the last 2 hours quietly dismantling whatever remained of her dignity, and she thought, "This is either the best thing that has ever happened to me or the worst, and I have no way of knowing which." She thought about her house on the edge of town, cold and quiet. She thought about tomorrow and the tomorrow after that. Identical, small, constrained by a dead man's reputation that would follow her to her own grave if she stayed. She thought about what it meant to spend your whole life being cautious and practical and sensible and still ending up alone next to a coat rack while everyone watched you be rejected. She took a breath. "All right," she said. The barn erupted, not loudly. Silver Hollow was not a town that erupted loudly. It erupted in a specific frontier way, a sharp murmur, the sound of 20 conversations beginning at once, a collective exhale that was half shock and half something else, something that Eleanor, pulling her coat fully onto both shoulders, chose not to examine too closely. "Tonight?" she asked him. "I have a wagon outside, if you need to gather things. I don't have much to gather." She said this plainly, without embarrassment. "An hour, maybe less." He nodded. "I'll wait." Martha Gaines materialized at Eleanor's elbow approximately 2 seconds later, grabbing her arm with a grip that was probably going to leave marks. "Eleanor," her voice was urgent and low. "Eleanor, you cannot be serious." "Martha, you don't know this man. He lives on a mountain, alone. People say he's—" Martha's voice dropped further, into territory that required discretion. "They say he's not right, Eleanor, not right in the head. Why else would a man with that kind of money live like a hermit?" "I imagine he likes being alone," Eleanor said. "That's not normal." "Martha." Eleanor turned to face her friend, her oldest friend, the woman who had talked her into coming tonight and had watched the entire evening unfold and had still not said a word when the fourth man turned away. She kept her voice gentle because Martha had a good heart and mostly meant well. "I came here tonight because you told me I couldn't hide forever. You were right, so I'm not hiding. I'm going." Martha looked stricken. "This isn't what I meant." "I know." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "Thank you for tonight." She left Martha standing there and walked toward the barn doors. Across the room she caught Dorothy Marsh's eye. Dorothy's expression was something she couldn't read. Complicated, layered, the expression of someone watching a story turn unexpectedly. Eleanor looked away first. Outside, the cold was absolute and real and indifferent to her in the way of things that were simply weather. No cruelty in it, no judgment, just the fact of it. A covered wagon stood in the yard, 2 horses, dark shapes in the dark. The lantern from the barn threw enough light to see by, barely. Gideon Wolfe came out behind her a minute later and walked to the wagon without speaking. He checked the horses in a brief, practiced way and then stood waiting. Eleanor looked up at the sky. The stars were out in the high cold, more of them than you ever saw from inside a town. The kind of sky that required darkness to exist properly. "How far?" she asked. 2 days, closer to 3 in this weather." She looked at him. In the dark, with the barn light at his back, his face was mostly shadow. She thought again, best or worst, best or worst. "Is there anything you want to know about me?" she asked. "Before we go." He seemed to consider this. "Can you ride?" "Reasonably well." "Can you handle a rifle?" "I've handled one. I wouldn't say I'm accomplished." "That can be fixed." A pause. "Are you afraid of heights?" "I don't know. I've never been particularly high." He nodded like this was a reasonable answer. "That's enough for now," he said. "We can talk on the road." Eleanor climbed up onto the wagon seat before he could offer to help her, which she suspected he hadn't been planning to do anyway. She settled herself and pulled her coat tighter and looked out at the dark road ahead. Behind them, through the walls of the Harlan barn, she could hear the fiddle player starting up again. Gideon Wolfe climbed up beside her and gathered the reins and clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon started to move. Silver Hollow slid past her on either side. The merchant's shuttered windows, the dark church, the house that had been her father's and then hers, and that she was leaving without any particular ceremony. She watched it go. She waited for the feeling that was supposed to come when you leave a place. Grief, maybe, or relief, or some clean emotion with a name. What came instead was just the cold, and the sound of the horse's hooves on the hard road, and the dark mountains ahead, enormous against the stars. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, after they'd been moving for a few minutes. "Gideon," he said. "Mr. is for lawyers and undertakers." "Gideon." She tried the word out. It fit him in the way that some names fit, like it had been made for that particular face. "Why me?" Silence for a moment. The horses moved. The dark moved around them. "I told you," he said. "I needed someone who could work and who wouldn't leave when things got hard." "You could have hired a man for that." "I've hired men." A pause. "They leave. Women leave too." "Some do." He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were on the road, on the dark ahead, on the particular quality of attention he seemed to give everything. "I had a feeling about you." "A feeling," she repeated, careful to keep anything resembling mockery out of her voice, because it didn't seem like mockery was a good idea right now. "Not romantic," he said, flatly and without apparent discomfort. "A practical feeling. The kind you get about tools or horses or the weather. Something that tells you this is the thing that will hold." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. A tool, she thought. A horse. The weather. She should have found that insulting. She noticed that she didn't, quite. There was something almost, not comforting, but grounding about it. After 2 hours of being evaluated for entirely the wrong things, of being found wanting because of things that had nothing to do with her, there was something strange and real about being wanted for her capacity to hold. "I might disappoint you," she said. "You might," he agreed. "That doesn't concern you?" He thought about it. "I've been disappointed before. I'll manage it." She almost laughed again, a real one this time, surprised out of her. She managed to keep it to a small sound, barely audible over the wheels on the road. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She paused. "Just, most men would lie." He looked at her then, sideways, a brief look. "I don't lie much. It takes energy I don't want to spend." "That's an interesting reason to be honest." "It's the honest one." The road curved north, and the mountains resolved out of the dark, closer than they'd seemed from town, enormous and white-peaked and genuinely indifferent to the small wagon moving toward them. Eleanor watched them come. She thought about the women back in that barn, Clara Webb, the Beaumont girls, Dorothy Marsh, and tried to imagine which of them would be sitting where she was sitting right now, moving toward those mountains. None of them. She wasn't sure whether that made her brave or simply desperate. She decided it probably didn't matter much, and pulled her coat tighter against the cold, and watched the mountains fill up the sky ahead. The road north wound through pine forest, the trees pressing close on either side, the wagon rocking on ground that was half frozen and uneven. The horses were steady animals, a matched pair of dark bays that Gideon handled with the casual competence of someone who'd been doing it long enough that it had stopped requiring thought. He didn't talk much. She'd expected that, or thought she had, but the quality of his silence was different from the silences she was used to. The silence of people who had nothing to say to her, the silence of a house alone. His silence was occupied somehow. Present. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a time. "You can ask." "Why haven't you hired a woman before? If you needed someone for the homestead." A long pause. Longer than usual. "I did," he said. She waited. 2 years ago. A widow from Alamosa. Seemed practical. Seemed capable. He paused. She lasted 4 months. Couldn't stand the isolation. Couldn't stand... He stopped. Started again. Couldn't stand a lot of things. "Did you..." She chose her words carefully. Was she treated fairly? His jaw tightened. Not anger, she thought. Something else. "I thought so. She didn't." A pause. "I don't always..." He seemed to be working something out, constructing a sentence from parts that didn't naturally fit. "I don't always explain myself well. I'm not..." He stopped again. Not what? Easy, he said. I'm told I'm not easy to live with. Eleanor considered this. Who told you that? The widow from Alamosa, a dry note in his voice. At length. What did she say specifically? He glanced at her, seemed surprised by the question. That I was cold, that I never explained my thinking, that I expected things without saying what those things were. He paused. She said living with me was like living with a door that might be locked or might be open but never told you which. Eleanor sat with that image. It was a precise description, she thought, precise and probably fair. And you think I'll be different? She asked. In what way? I think you know what it is to figure things out without being told. His voice was careful. I think you've had to read rooms and situations and people your whole life because nobody was going to do it for you. That's a different kind of person. She was quiet for a moment. That's perceptive. I pay attention. You do, she agreed. The trees thickened around them, the road narrowing, the last lights of Silver Hollow long gone behind them. Ahead, the dark was complete except for the stars and the dim reflected white of snow on the peaks above. It was genuinely cold now, the kind of cold that found its way through wool and leather and made you very aware that you were a warm animal in an environment that wasn't designed with warm animals in mind. Eleanor's feet were numb. She didn't say anything about it. After a while, Gideon reached behind the seat without looking and produced a heavy blanket, rough wool, smelling of cedar and horse, and held it out to her. She took it, pulled it over her lap, and the worst of the cold retreated to the edges. Thank you, she said. He nodded, kept driving. She thought he knew my feet were cold, and he did something about it without making a production of it. It was such a small thing. It was, she realized, not a small thing at all, Shambasin. They stopped twice in the night, once to rest the horses, and once because Eleanor, who had been determined not to admit to any weakness for at least the first 24 hours, finally had to acknowledge that she needed to stop. She climbed down from the wagon with cramped legs and disappeared into the trees and came back to find him crouched by a small fire, which he had built in approximately the time it would have taken her to gather the wood. A pot of water was heating. He had coffee in a tin, and he made it without asking whether she wanted any and handed her a cup when she came close to the fire. Sit, he said, gesturing at the log he'd dragged close to the flames. She sat. The fire was small but efficient, throwing just enough heat. The pine trees stood around them in the dark, enormous and still. Somewhere distant, something called an owl maybe, or something else. She didn't know enough about this territory yet to be sure. You're not what I expected, she said. He looked at her across the fire. What did you expect? I'm not sure. Something rougher, maybe. The stories... She paused. The stories make you sound like something out of a dime novel. Stories usually do. He drank his coffee. I'm a man who traps animals and builds things and prefers mountains to towns. That's the whole of it. The widow from Alamosa, Eleanor said. Was she frightened of you? He was quiet for a moment. At first, and then? And then she wasn't frightened, she was just unhappy. He turned his cup in his hands, big hands, scarred across the knuckles in the particular way of someone who works with ropes and metal and cold. Those are different problems. They are, she agreed. She looked at him across the fire and thought, I am sitting in the middle of a pine forest in the Rocky Mountains at what must be 2 a.m. with a man I met 4 hours ago, and I am not frightened. She examined this fact carefully, the way you examine a wound to see how bad it actually is. She could find genuine concern in it. She wasn't naive. She understood that this situation was objectively unusual, and that unusual situations could go badly. But underneath the reasonable concern, there was something else. Something quieter. The absence of a particular dread. She'd been frightened plenty in her life. She knew what it felt like. This wasn't it. We should sleep a few hours, Gideon said, before the road gets harder. In the wagon? I have blankets enough. She thought about Dorothy Marsh, who would by now have relayed a version of tonight's events to everyone she knew. She thought about Agnes Porter, who would be framing it as a tragedy or a scandal or possibly both. She thought about what Silver Hollow would say tomorrow and the day after and all the days after that. She found she couldn't make herself care very much. All right, she said. She climbed back into the wagon and arranged herself in the bed, with the rough blankets piled over her, and looked up at the strip of sky visible between the pine tops. The stars had shifted from where they'd been above the barn, different angle, different part of the sky. She closed her eyes. In the 3 years since her father died, she had gotten very efficient at sleeping, at shutting herself down the way you shut down a house in winter, fast and practical, no lingering at the windows. She had learned not to lie awake with her thoughts because her thoughts in that empty house had not been good company. But tonight, unexpectedly, she did linger a little, that goshi. She thought about the barn, the row of men, the cornbread she hadn't tasted, Agnes Porter's careful suggestion that she leave. She thought about the moment the doors opened. She thought about what he'd said. I had a feeling about you. Something that tells you this is the thing that will hold. The thing that will hold. She turned on her side, the wagon wood solid beneath her, the cold pressed back by the wool, and she thought, I don't know if he's right. I don't know if I can hold. I've never been tested that way. Then she thought, well, I suppose I'm about to find out. She slept. The morning came gray and bitter, the sky the color of old pewter, and Eleanor climbed stiffly out of the wagon at first light with a spine that had opinions about wooden wagon beds and hands so cold she had to work her fingers slowly before they would cooperate. Gideon was already up. The fire was out, no trace of it but a black circle in the frost, and the horses had been checked and watered from a flat stream that ran near the road. He was loading things back into the wagon with the quick, certain movements of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Coffee's in the tin on the seat, he said, without turning around. She found it, drank it cold because there was no time to heat it, and it was still better than nothing. How much further? She asked. Good day's travel to the base, then we start climbing. She looked ahead, where the road narrowed and began to curve upward into country that was strictly speaking no longer the kind of terrain that roads were designed for. All right, she said. He glanced at her then, quick, assessing. You're sore, he said. I'm fine. The bed is... He paused. There's not much to it. I'll get something better for the return trip. She looked at him. The return trip. As if it was settled. As if she was already there and would be staying. You seem very confident, she said. About what? That this arrangement will work. He was quiet for a moment, adjusting something on the wagon's rigging with the particular focus he seemed to bring to mechanical things. I'm confident about most arrangements I decide to make, he said. I don't decide lightly. Neither do I, she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression, just for a moment, that she couldn't quite name. Then he turned back to the horses. We should go, he said. Weather's coming. She looked at the sky. The gray was deepening in the northwest, the clouds building in the way that meant something serious. She'd grown up in this territory. She knew the shape of weather. How bad? She asked. Bad enough? He climbed up to the seat. But we can be inside before it hits if we move. She climbed up beside him. The wagon rolled forward into the gray morning, the road rising ahead, the mountains massive and cold and extraordinary against the darkening sky. The pines gave way to rock and open slope, and the wind came at them with nothing to break it, carrying the bite of coming snow. Eleanor pulled the blanket tighter and set her jaw against the cold and looked up at the mountains that were going to be her home now, or her failure, and decided, quietly, without drama, in the plain way of a person who has simply made a decision, that she was going to make them her home. Whatever that cost, whatever it took. She was done being the woman who stood by the coat rack. The horses leaned into the grade, the wagon groaned on the rising road, and the first snowflakes began to fall. The snow started as a suggestion, thin flakes that melted the instant they touched the horses' dark backs, and then became a fact. By mid-morning, it was falling in earnest, the kind of steady, committed snowfall that didn't make a drama of itself but simply accumulated, covering the road in a white that made the track ahead hard to distinguish from the slope on either side. Eleanor sat with the blanket across her lap and her hands tucked under her arms and watched the world turn uniformly white and told herself she was not cold in a way that was becoming increasingly unconvincing. Gideon drove without apparent concern. He watched the road the way he seemed to watch most things, with a complete, unhurried attention that suggested he was processing information she wasn't even collecting. Once he pulled the horses to a brief stop, studied the sky to the northwest for a long moment, then clicked his tongue and moved them forward again. He didn't explain why he'd stopped. She didn't ask. "The road gets narrower," he said after a while, "and rougher. It's going to be uncomfortable." "It's already uncomfortable," she said. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "It's going to be more so." He wasn't wrong. The road, and she was using that word generously now because it was really more of a suggestion of a road, a theory of a road, a memory of a road that had once existed and was now under several inches of snow, wound up through terrain that made her grip the seat edge with both hands. The wagon tilted and lurched and once dropped hard into a rut that sent everything in the wagon bed sliding and made Eleanor bite down on a sound she didn't want to make. "You can hold the side rail," Gideon said. "I noticed that option," she said, and grabbed it. He made a sound that was definitively a laugh, short and dry, but a laugh. She filed that away. They stopped at noon in a stand of spruce where the trees cut the wind enough to make it bearable. He built a small fire, faster than she'd clocked him doing it the night before, maybe 5 minutes from cold ground to actual flame, and she understood watching him that this was a skill as fundamental to him as breathing, something his hands knew without requiring instruction from his brain. He heated dried beef and hard biscuits in a pan, which was not good food by any measure, but was hot, and hot mattered more than good at this particular moment. She ate standing up because sitting down meant sitting in snow, and she'd made enough concessions to discomfort already. "Tell me about the homestead," she said. He was crouched by the fire, turning the pan with the automatic efficiency she was already coming to recognize as characteristic. "What do you want to know?" "What it looks like, how big it is, what you've built." He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone avoiding the question, but of someone who doesn't often put things into words and needs a moment to do it. "Main cabin's 2 rooms. Solid. I built it with 12-inch logs. It holds heat better than most structures I've been in. There's a separate structure for storage and a barn for the animals." He paused. "Root cellar. A smokehouse I finished last fall. A spring about 40 feet from the cabin that runs year-round, even in hard winter." "How long did it take to build?" "The cabin itself, 1 summer. The rest, I've been adding for 4 years. Another pause. "It's not finished. Things like that aren't finished exactly. You keep adding as you need." "What needs adding now?" He looked at her. "Why?" "Because if I'm going to be managing it, I should know what state it's in." He studied her for a moment with that level attention, then looked back at the fire. "The eastern wall of the barn needs reinforcing before next winter. The smokehouse door hangs wrong, Shaw's. It doesn't seal the way it should, and I lose heat. Root cellar could use more shelving." He paused. "The main room could use a second window. Gets dark." "I can build shelving," Eleanor said. He looked at her again. "My father was not a useful man," she said, without particular bitterness, just the plain fact of it. "So I learned to do the things he couldn't. I've built shelving, replaced a porch board, fixed a roof leak with pitch and cedar shingles." She paused. "I'm not a carpenter, but I can manage the practical things." "Good," he said. Simply, without elaboration. But something in the word had weight. They ate in a silence that was, she noticed, not uncomfortable. She'd spent enough time with silence to know the difference between kinds. The hostile silence of people who didn't want to talk to you, and the absent silence of people who weren't paying attention, and the more unusual silence of someone who simply didn't require conversation to fill time. Gideon Wolfe was the third kind. It didn't demand anything of her. She thought this might be something she could work with. The fire went out in the snow and they moved on. The afternoon was harder. The road, she'd stopped calling it that internally, now it was simply the way up, climbed in switchbacks through terrain that grew increasingly severe. On her left, the mountain rose sharply. On her right, the ground dropped away into a valley that was beautiful and absolutely fatal-looking, a long white fall to a frozen stream far below. She kept her eyes forward. Once the wagon's rear wheels slid on an icy patch, and she grabbed the rail and felt the whole vehicle shudder in a way that seemed like genuine prelude to catastrophe. And then Gideon had the horses in hand and they were steady again, and he hadn't made a sound during any of it. "Does that happen often?" she asked, when her heart had returned to its normal location. "Sometimes," he said. "What do you do if the wagon goes over?" He He was quiet for a moment. You jump clear. Get as far from the horses as you can. Have you had to do that? Once. Broke 2 ribs. He said this with no more inflection than he might report the price of flour. Wagon was a loss, lost most of the season's supplies. Eleanor looked at the drop to her right. And then? Then I walked down to the nearest settlement and resupplied and went back up. She looked at him. With 2 broken ribs. There's not a lot of alternative, he said. You can't stay where you are. You can't leave things half done. You get up and you figure out the next thing. She turned this over. It wasn't philosophy. It wasn't delivered as philosophy, at least. It was just a description of what had happened, what he'd done. The matter-of-factness of it was somehow more instructive than any amount of deliberate wisdom. You get up and you figure out the next thing. She'd been doing something like that for 3 years. She just hadn't had a name for it. The light was going when they came to the first camp, a rough structure, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, built into the side of the slope under a granite overhang that kept the worst of the snow off. Gideon called it a way station. He had 3 of them on the route between the homestead and town, each a day's journey apart, each stocked with enough firewood and basic supplies to make a night survivable. It was by any ordinary standard extremely bleak inside. A plank bunk against one wall, a small iron stove, a crate that held a coffee tin, a bag of dried beans, and a half-depleted sack of cornmeal, a single lantern hanging from a nail. Eleanor stood in the middle of it and said nothing. Gideon got the stove going. The wood was dry. He kept it that way, she would learn, everything organized against the eventual moment of need. And the fire caught fast and threw heat that the small space accumulated quickly. Within 20 minutes, it was bearable. Within 40, it was warm enough to take off her coat. She sat on the edge of the bunk, which was boards with a blanket over them, and thought, this is where I'm sleeping tonight, and it is fine. This is fine. You're doing the thing, Gideon said. She looked up. He was across the small space, adding a second log to the stove, his back to her. What thing? Convincing yourself something is all right. He latched the stove door and turned around. Your face does a thing when you're working on that. She blinked. Nobody had ever told her that before. What does my face do? Goes very still, like a pond when there's no wind. She didn't know what to do with that. It's fine, she said. The accommodation is fine. It's rough, he said. I know it's rough. You don't have to pretend it isn't. I'm not pretending. Eleanor. He said her name with a directness that landed somewhere behind her sternum. You came from a town where people have been making you pretend things are fine for 3 years. You don't have to do that with me. She looked at him for a long moment. The stove ticked and popped behind him. The lantern light threw shadows up the rough log walls, and the wind outside pressed against the small structure with a persistence that she would eventually learn was just the ordinary sound of this altitude. All right, she said. It's bleak. The bunk looks like sleeping on a door. The wind sounds like it's trying to get in, and is personally offended that it can't. Good, he said. That's the truth of it. Is that better? It's more useful. He pulled the crate out and started working on something with the dried beans and the small pot, the efficient motions of someone who has cooked in worse conditions than this many times. If you tell me things are fine when they're not, I don't know what to fix. She watched him cook. He wasn't particularly graceful at it. He measured things by instinct and got the fire wrong the first time and had to adjust. But he was competent in the way that mattered, which was that food was produced and it was hot and it was enough. He handed her a bowl without ceremony and sat across from her on the crate and ate his own. Can I ask you something personal? She said. Probably. The widow from Alamosa. What was her name? He looked at her. Ruth, he said. Ruth Carey. What happened to her after she left? Went back to Alamosa, married a farmer, last I heard. A pause. She made the right choice. The mountains aren't right for everyone. I didn't... He stopped, seemed to be weighing something. I wasn't easy on her. I see that now. I expected her to adapt without explaining what she was adapting to. Eleanor considered this. What would you have explained if you'd known to? He was quiet for a moment, looking at his bowl. That the isolation gets physical, he said. It's not just an absence of people. It's a presence of something else. The quiet, the scale of it. Some people find it peaceful. Some people find it like being buried. He paused. I should have told her that before she came. You're telling me now. I am. Does that mean you learned something? His jaw moved. Not quite a smile. I hope so. She finished her beans, which were plain and somewhat undersalted, and stared at the near wall of the shelter while the stove worked and the wind pressed and the darkness outside became complete. She thought about Silver Hollow, which felt already further away than one day's travel should account for. She thought about Martha Gaines and what she must be saying. She thought about her house, the cold, empty rooms, the needlework basket on the table. She didn't feel grief about any of it. She wasn't sure what she felt. Something that hadn't settled into a name yet. Can I ask you something now? Gideon said. Yes. When did it get bad? In town? For your family? She was quiet for a moment. It was bad before the mine, she said. My father was charming and unreliable, and my mother knew it and loved him anyway, which I think wore her down over time. The mine just... She paused. The mine made it public. Before that, it was a private thing, the way a lot of difficult marriages are private. After, there was nothing private about any of it. How old were you? When he took the money? 19. When he died, 21. She turned her bowl in her hands. By then, my mother had been gone a year. She got sick the winter he lost everything. I think she was already tired, and the sickness, it moved fast. You were alone at 21. Yes. And you stayed. I didn't have anywhere to go. She paused. And I had debts with my name attached to them, even though I hadn't made them. I wasn't going to leave without settling what I could. She paused. That's probably the thing that made me stay that I'm least sure about. What do you mean? Whether it was integrity or stubbornness. She set the bowl down. My mother called it my good-bad quality. The part of me that won't let go of things even when letting go would be easier. He looked at her. In the lantern light, the amber of his eyes was darker, more like old wood than river water. I'd call that integrity, he said. You might. The town called it stubbornness. Said I should have moved on instead of trying to pay off a dead man's debts. The town didn't have your name on the debts. No, she said. They didn't. He was quiet for a moment. The people you owe, are they settled? The ones I could reach, yes. There's one, a man named Aldrich in Pueblo. I've written 3 times and never received an answer. I don't know if he's dead or if he simply doesn't want to engage. She paused. I have $17 set aside for him still. Gideon's expression shifted. You've been setting aside money for a man who might be dead. I owe it. He studied her for a long moment. Then he looked away, at the stove, at nothing in particular. We'll find out, he said. When I go to Pueblo in the fall, I'll find Aldrich. She stared at him. You don't have to. I go to Pueblo every fall for supplies. It's not additional trouble. Gideon. She said his name with the same directness he'd used on hers and saw him register it. I don't expect you to manage my debts. I'm not managing your debts, he said. I'm passing through Pueblo and making an inquiry. Those are different things. He stood up and collected the bowls with the economic movements that seemed to be his natural mode. You should sleep. Tomorrow's harder than today. She looked at the plank bunk. Harder than today, she repeated. Yes. In what way? The pass, he said. We go through it tomorrow. It's not... He paused, and she understood that he was doing something deliberate, which was telling her the truth about a thing instead of managing her expectations. It's steep and exposed, and with this snow, it will be slow, and there's no shelter in the middle of it. We'll need to move straight through without stopping. Eleanor absorbed this. How long through the pass? 3 hours. Maybe 4 if the snow is bad. She thought about the wagon tilting toward the drop, the wheels on ice, the horses leaning into the grade. She thought about 4 hours of that on terrain that was harder than what they'd already covered. All right, she said. He looked at her like he was expecting something else. That's all? What else would you like me to say? Most people have more questions or objections. I have questions, she said. But none of them change the situation. The pass is there. We have to go through it, and worrying about it tonight won't make it shorter tomorrow. She paused. Is there anything I should know that would actually help? He considered this. If I tell you to do something, do it immediately. Don't think about it. Don't ask why. The horses will tell you things before I do sometimes. If they stop, there's a reason. What reason? Could be the ground ahead isn't solid. Could be ice. Could be a crack under the snow. When they hesitate, you hesitate. She nodded. What else? If you fall, curl and roll away from the slope edge. Don't try to grab things on the way down. It just gives you more to break. He said this with the flat practicality of someone who has given this speech to the terrain itself, to himself, many times. And keep your weight forward on descents, not back. I'll try to remember that. You will remember it, he said. When you need to, you will. She was too tired to parse what exactly he meant by that, whether it was confidence in her specifically or just a general statement about human beings under pressure. She lay down on the plank bunk with the rough blanket pulled over her and closed her eyes and listened to the wind work itself against the walls, finding no purchase. She slept in pieces, waking twice to wind gusts that shook the structure and once to the sound of something moving outside, something large, and lying still in the dark listening until it moved away. She didn't know what it was. She decided not to know, at least not tonight, and went back to sleep. Morning came in the color of pewter again, but different. Lighter, the snow stopped, the sky to the east showing the first thin yellow edge of something that might become sun. She climbed out of the bunk and pulled on her boots and coat with stiff hands and went outside and stood in air so cold it felt solid. The world up here was a different category of landscape than the one she'd grown up in. The valley below was invisible, lost in morning cloud. The slopes above were white to the tree line and gray rock above that, and then the ridge line against the sky, hard and clear and far away and enormous. She had grown up looking at mountains. She had not understood until this moment that looking at mountains and being inside them were different experiences entirely. It was, objectively, one of the most beautiful things she'd ever seen. It was also, objectively, terrifying in a way that had nothing to do with the specific danger of the pass or the cold or any practical threat. It was the scale of it, the indifference of it, the way it simply existed, immense and ongoing, without any reference to the small woman standing at the door of a rough shelter having the most significant week of her life. "Eat something before we go," Gideon's voice behind her. She turned. He was standing in the shelter doorway with 2 cups of coffee and what appeared to be yesterday's biscuits, hard and cold. She took both the offered cup and biscuit without comment and kept looking at the mountains. "Does it ever—" She stopped. "What?" "Stop being like this. Do you ever stop noticing it?" He came to stand beside her, a little behind, looking out at the same thing she was looking at. "I've been going up and down this route for 6 years," he said. "It doesn't stop. Is that part of why you stay up here? Despite—" She glanced at him. "Everything you give up." He was quiet for a moment. "There are different kinds of company," he said, "and different kinds of quiet." He drank his coffee. "Down there?" He didn't gesture at Silver Hollow specifically, just at the general direction of down, of towns, of other people and their various demands. Down there, everything wants something from you, every conversation, every look. Up here, he paused. The mountain doesn't want anything. It just is. She understood that in a way she hadn't expected to. She thought about the barn, the weight of all those watching eyes, all of them wanting something from her, some of them wanting her to fail so the story could be coherent, some of them wanting her to succeed so they could be magnanimous about it, very few of them wanting simply nothing, wanting to just let her be. "Yes," she said, "I understand that." He looked at her sideways. "I thought you might." They went through the pass. She would not later be able to describe it clearly. Memory does that with extreme experience, breaks it into pieces, drops some, sharpens others past the point of accuracy. What she remembered was the width of the track, which was barely enough for the wagon and had no margin, and the way the air changed at elevation, thin and bright and unforgiving, and the sound of the horses breathing, labored and steady, the plumes of their breath visible in the cold. She remembered her hands on the side rail, white-knuckled, and the way she made herself look forward rather than to the right where the drop was. Once the lead horse, the bigger bay, stopped dead. She didn't ask why. She didn't think. She held completely still. Gideon had the reins in one hand and was looking at the track ahead, that complete attentive focus. After a moment, he said, "Easy," to the horse in a low voice, and they moved again, veering slightly left. She looked at where they'd been about to go and saw the snow there had a different quality, a flatness over nothing, the particular texture of surface with no substance under it. "Good," he said quietly, and she understood the word was directed at the horse, but she felt it anyway. 4 hours. The descent on the other side was its own particular misery, slow and braked and the wagon groaning against the grade, but the exposure was less, the slopes gentler, the trees coming back up around them like something returning to normal. When the track leveled into something that could once again be called a road, Eleanor released the side rail and flexed her hands and found they were shaking slightly. She put them under the blanket and waited for the shaking to stop. Gideon didn't comment on this. After a while, he said, "You did well." She looked at him. "I held a railing." "You didn't panic." He said this like it was a significant data point, which she supposed it was. Some people panic, makes everything harder. "I was frightened," she said, because she was doing the thing he'd asked her to do, the truth-telling thing, the not-pretending thing. "I know," he said. "I could see it." A pause. "You were frightened and you stayed still and you paid attention. That's the whole of it." She looked ahead at the road, which was descending now into a valley that she could see opened up before them, wide and white-floored, ringed by higher peaks. Tucked against the northern slope of the valley, where the tree cover was thickest, there was a dark shape. Several dark shapes, actually. Structures. She stared. "Is that?" "Yes," he said. She looked at the homestead as they descended toward it. The main cabin first, larger than she'd imagined, the log walls dark with age and pitch, smoke coming from the chimney because he'd built the fire before leaving, she realized days ago, time to still be burning when they arrived. The barn slightly separate, the smaller structures around it. The whole thing tucked into the mountain flank like something that had grown there, organic and purposeful, built to last. Not beautiful, exactly. Not the way the mountains were beautiful, but solid, real. A human-made thing that had withstood several winters in this place and was still standing. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "I told you 2 rooms. 2 rooms can mean different things." The wagon rolled down into the valley and the wind dropped with the elevation, and the last of the afternoon light was coming at a low angle off the snow, golden and brief. The horses picked up their pace a little, recognizing home. They pulled up to the cabin, and Gideon tied off the reins and climbed down and went to see to the horses without asking her to wait or instructing her what to do. She climbed down herself stiffly and stood in front of the cabin door. It was a heavy door, well-fitted, iron latch. She put her hand on it. She thought about the barn in Silver Hollow. She thought about Agnes Porter. She thought about 24 years of a town knowing her name and everything wrong with it. She lifted the latch and pushed the door open. Inside, a main room, bigger than the exterior suggested, with a stone fireplace that covered most of one wall and was radiating heat from coals that had banked themselves down to a slow warmth over the days they'd traveled. A table, solid and plain. 2 chairs. Shelves along the opposite wall, some filled, some not. She'd been right about the shelving needing work. A second door that she supposed led to the back room. 2 windows, both small, and she understood immediately what he meant about needing a second. The room had a cave-like quality to it, despite the fireplace. The floor was wood, planed flat. The ceiling was low enough that Gideon would have to mind his head in places. The whole thing smelled of wood smoke and pine, and something underneath both that she could only describe as the smell of a place that has been lived in alone for a long time. She stood in the middle of the room. She was exhausted down to her actual bones. Her back hurt, her hands hurt. Her feet had passed through cold into something beyond that, into a kind of numb acceptance. She had eaten nothing since the cold biscuit that morning. She looked at the stone fireplace, the banked coals. She found wood in the box beside it and added 2 logs and crouched and worked the coals back up to flame with a patience she didn't quite feel but deployed anyway. The fire took. The room brightened. She stood up and turned around. This was her home now. Whatever it was going to become, it started from this. A cold room getting warmer, a fire she'd just built, a floor that needed sweeping, shelves that needed filling. The raw materials of a life. She heard Gideon's boots on the step outside, the familiar sound of him, and the door opened. He came in and looked at the fire she'd built and then at her. "I was going to do that," he said. I know, she said. I did it. He stood there for a moment, snow still on his shoulders, looking at her across the room. Something moved through his expression, too quick and complicated to catalog. There's dried venison in the crate by the far shelf, he said finally, and cornmeal. I'll cook, she said. You see to the horses. A pause. Then he nodded, a single motion, and went back out. Eleanor Cross found the venison and the cornmeal and the salt and the small cast-iron pan. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her back still hurt and her feet were still wrong-feeling, and she was hungry enough that the thought of food was almost physical. She built the fire up further, hung the pot, started working. Outside, she could hear him moving between the cabin and the barn, the sounds of the animals settling, the occasional creak of the structure against the wind that still came down off the peaks with its persistent impersonal force. The food came together slowly, the way things do when you're working with unfamiliar equipment in an unfamiliar space, compensating for the way the heat ran in the pan, finding where things were kept by trial and error. It wasn't good. The venison was tough, and the cornmeal cakes came out uneven. But it was hot. She set 2 plates on the table when she heard him come back in. He looked at the table, looked at her, said nothing for a moment. It's not much, she said. It's more than I'd have done tonight, he said. He sat down and ate with the same economy he brought to everything. After a few minutes, the cornmeal is better than mine. Your fire runs hot on the right side, she said. You have to compensate. He looked at the stove. I know that. I forget. I'll remember, she said. He looked at her then. Steady, that complete attention, and she held it without looking away, which she was finding was simply what you did with him. You met his eyes because looking away felt like flinching, and she was done with flinching. You're going to be all right up here, he said. Not a question. I expect I am, she said. The fire snapped behind her. The wind ran its cold hands along the outside of the cabin and found no way in. Beyond the walls, the mountains stood in their permanent way, vast and indifferent, and she was beginning to understand, not hostile, just present, just themselves. She finished her food and set the plate aside and looked at the uneven shelves and the room that needed a second window and the floor that needed sweeping, and thought about all the work ahead of her. She was not afraid of work. That, at least, had never been her problem. The first week was the hardest, and not for the reasons Eleanor had anticipated. She had expected the cold to be the problem. She had expected the isolation, the physical demands, the steep learning curve of a life lived at altitude where everything, fire starting, food preservation, even the simple act of hauling water, required more effort than it did at lower elevation. She had prepared herself for all of that, or tried to. What she hadn't prepared for was how much she didn't know that she didn't know. The first morning she went to the spring to haul water, she filled both buckets and started back and slipped on the iced ground between the spring and the cabin and went down hard on her left knee and spilled both buckets completely. She sat on the frozen ground for a moment, knee throbbing, staring at the water already absorbed into the snow, and thought very clearly, this is going to take longer than I thought. She got up, went back to the spring, filled the buckets again, this time with her weight lower, her steps shorter, her attention on the ground instead of the cabin door ahead. She made it back without spilling. Gideon watched this from the barn doorway, she discovered later. He didn't come to help, didn't comment. She only knew because she asked him directly, 2 weeks in, why there were 2 parallel lines of wood ash running from the spring to the cabin along the most used path. The ash gives grip, he said, on the ice. She looked at the lines, looked at him. You did that the first morning. After I watched you go down, he said. He wasn't apologetic about it exactly. I should have done it before you went out. I forget that other people haven't learned the paths yet. You could have told me, she said. Yes, he agreed. I could have. A pause. I'm better at fixing things than warning about them. I noticed. She said it without particular irritation, which seemed to surprise him. I'll start a list. Things I should know that you know, but won't think to mention. He looked at her. What kind of list? Where the ice forms, which wood burns longest, how far I can push the horses before they need rest, that kind of thing. She paused. Things that live in your head that you don't know aren't obvious. He was quiet for a moment. That's a sensible idea, he said, like it had occurred to him that it was sensible, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. They started the list that evening after supper, Gideon talking and Eleanor writing in the small notebook she'd brought from Silver Hollow. One of the few things she'd packed, along with 2 changes of clothes, her mother's shawl, and $17 in a cloth envelope. The list went for 3 pages that first session, and grew over the following weeks into something that lived on the shelf near the door and that both of them added to, in different handwriting, as new things surfaced. It was, she would later think, the first real evidence that they were figuring out how to live together. The work itself was relentless. Winter at that elevation was not seasonal inconvenience. It was a constant active force that required constant active response. Wood had to be split and stacked daily because the cold burned through it faster than she'd have believed possible. The animals needed tending twice a day without exception, and the barn, she quickly understood, was its own small ecosystem requiring management. The food stores had to be monitored, rotated, protected against the cold that would freeze them and the warmth that would spoil them, a narrow corridor between 2 kinds of loss. Her body, which she had considered functional and reasonably capable, turned out to have opinions about all of this. By the end of the second week, her hands had cracked at the knuckles from the cold and the constant wet and dry cycle of outdoor work. She wrapped them at night in strips of cloth she'd cut from a worn shirt and said nothing about them because they weren't preventing her from working. By the 3rd week, she had developed a competence with the axe that she was privately pleased about. Not skill, exactly, but a functional rhythm, weight and angle and follow-through, the wood splitting along the grain when she found it right. One afternoon, Gideon came around the corner of the cabin and stopped. Watching her work through most of a cord of pine without stopping, and something on his face, she was still learning to read his face, still cataloging its limited but real vocabulary, shifted into something that wasn't quite approval, but was in the neighborhood of it. "You're wasting movement on the backswing," he said. She lowered the axe. "Show me." He took it, demonstrated, a shorter, more controlled arc, the power coming from the hips rather than the arms. She watched carefully, took the axe back and tried it. "Better," he said. "It doesn't feel as strong." "It doesn't need to feel strong. It needs to be efficient." He paused. "You have to do this for months. Feeling strong doesn't matter if you're worn out by February." She tried again, and again. He stood and watched without apparent impatience, which she was coming to understand was simply how he was, patient with practical learning in a way he wasn't always patient with other things. When she got it closer to right, he said, "There," in a flat voice and walked away, which was his version of enthusiastic feedback. She smiled at the woodpile. Nobody saw it. The dynamic between them settled into something she hadn't expected and couldn't have predicted, a working rhythm that had its own logic. Mornings were separate. He was up before light, had the fire going and coffee on, and was usually in the barn or working on something external before she was properly awake. She took over the inside, breakfast, the water, whatever needed doing in the cabin, and then they joined on the larger tasks, the ones that required 2 people. He gave directions without explaining them and then slowly began explaining them when she asked. She asked often enough that eventually he started anticipating her questions, which she noticed but didn't comment on. She cooked. He cleaned the dishes, which she hadn't asked for and which he simply did without negotiation from the first week. She understood this was his way of accounting. She did one thing, he did the equivalent other, the balance maintained without discussion. It wasn't easy. It wasn't smooth. There were days when his silences felt less companionable and more like walls, and she couldn't tell whether something was wrong or whether this was just how he moved through certain days, and asking felt like intruding on territory she hadn't been given access to yet. There were days when she was short-tempered from cold and fatigue and said things with an edge that she didn't quite intend, and he would go quiet in a different way. Not hurt, she didn't think, but recalibrating, the way you recalibrate around something that moves unexpectedly. One evening in the 4th week, she snapped at him over something small, the placement of a tool, some minor disorganization, and immediately knew it was the wrong response to the wrong thing, that what she was actually tired of was the cold in her cracked hands and the particular quality of exhaustion that accumulated over weeks without relief. She stood there in the aftermath of it, the small, sharp words hanging in the air between them. "I apologize," she said. "That was unfair." He looked at her. "It was," he said, not cruelly. just the flat acknowledgement of it. "I'm tired," she said. "My hands hurt, and I've been cold for 4 weeks, and that's not your fault, and I shouldn't have—" "Eleanor," he said it quietly. "You don't need to explain it, just—" He paused, seeming to search for what he meant. "Don't swallow it either. If you're tired and hurting, say so. Not at me, but say it." She blinked. "Why?" "Because if you tell me, I can do something about it, or not do something that makes it worse." He paused. "I'd rather know." She looked at her hands, the wrapped knuckles. "My hands," she said. "I've been managing it, but it's getting worse." He was quiet for a moment, then moved to the shelf on the far wall and rummaged through the back of it in a way that suggested he knew exactly where something was and was locating it without looking. He produced a small tin and brought it over and set it on the table in front of her. "Rendered bear fat with calendula," he said. "I make it in the fall, for the hands." He paused. "I should have given it to you 3 weeks ago. I keep it for myself and I forgot you'd need it." She opened the tin. The smell was odd, animal and herbal, not unpleasant. She worked it into her cracked knuckles and felt the immediate quality of it, the way it sat on skin rather than evaporating like water, actual barrier rather than temporary relief. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and sat back down at the table where he'd been sharpening a trapping knife, the small, careful motions of the whetstone on the blade. After a moment, she sat down across from him and picked up her mending. They sat like that for an hour, the fire working, the wind outside making its usual case for itself, neither of them talking. But it was different from the silences of those first days. Less like two people in the same space and more like two people in a shared space, which is a distinction that sounds subtle and isn't. She started to know things about him the way you come to know things about the landscape you move through. Not all at once, not through any organized effort, but gradually, through accumulated detail. He didn't sleep well. She knew this because she was a light sleeper herself and heard him sometimes at odd hours. The sound of him moving in the main room, the stove being stoked when it didn't need stoking, the particular quality of quiet that meant a person was awake and not at ease. She never commented on it, but she started banking the fire higher in the evenings so the coals would last longer, and she noticed that the nighttime moving around happened less frequently after she started doing that, and she didn't know if there was a connection, and it didn't particularly matter. He had a system for everything. Every tool had a location, every supply had a rotation, every task had a sequence. At first this seemed like rigidity, and then she understood it was actually a form of care, that up here, where the margin for error was genuinely small, organization was not a preference, but a form of safety. She adopted his systems where they made sense and modified them where she had improvements, and the second part she did carefully, transparently, explaining her reasoning. He listened, considered, and either agreed or explained why his way mattered. Both of these happened roughly equally, which she respected. He could fix almost anything mechanical. She watched him rebuild the smokehouse door mechanism over 3 cold mornings, his big hands working in gloves too thick for fine work, swearing quietly under his breath when something wouldn't cooperate. He swore in an interesting variety. She collected the phrases privately with something that was almost amusement, and then fixed whatever it was anyway. He read in the evenings sometimes. She hadn't expected that. He had a small shelf of books, not many, maybe a dozen, that included what appeared to be a surveying manual, 2 volumes of natural history, a battered copy of Thoreau's Walden that looked like it had been read many times, and a collection of Shakespeare plays bound in cracked leather. She picked up the Shakespeare one evening while he was reading the natural history, and he watched her do it without comment. "Have you read these?" she asked. "Some of them." "Which?" He thought about it. "The tragedies, mostly." She looked at the spine. "That's a particular preference." "They're more honest," he said. She opened to a page at random and read for a while. He went back to his book. The fire burned. The wind ran its nightly examination of the cabin's defenses and found them, as always, adequate. "Can I read this?" she asked, meaning borrow it. "It's yours if you want it," he said, without looking up. She looked at him. "I don't need you to give me your books." "I've read them." He turned a page. "It's more useful with you." She kept the Shakespeare. She told herself she'd return it when she was done, and then she never did, and he never asked for it back. The cold deepened in the 5th week in a way that felt less like weather and more like the mountain asserting something fundamental. The temperature dropped to a range that Gideon told her, flatly, could kill an unprotected person in under 20 minutes. He told her this not as a warning, but as a data point, in the same voice he used to tell her about the ash paths and the wood rotation, and she received it that way. Useful information, not threat. She started understanding the cold as a language. It had degrees, textures. The cold that came off the peaks in the morning had a different quality than the cold that settled in the valley at night. The cold that preceded a storm was specific. A particular stillness, a heaviness in the air, the animals restless. She learned to read the horses, which turned out to be as accurate as any barometer she'd encountered. One morning she came in from the barn and said, "Storm coming, 2 hours maybe." And Gideon, who was splitting kindling in the side yard, looked at the sky and then at her and said, "Agreed." And they spent the next 90 minutes doing the things you did before a storm. Securing the barn, moving the wood supply inside, checking the root cellar, making sure everything was where it needed to be. The storm came in 90 minutes. He didn't say anything about her being right. He didn't need to. The simple fact of it was sufficient. She was learning to operate in that kind of economy, where things were simply done or not done, where the feedback was the outcome rather than the approval, where she didn't need someone to tell her she'd done well because the wood was split and the animals were fed and the storm was survived, and that was its own accounting. It changed something in her, slowly, something she didn't have words for yet but could feel. A realignment, like a door rehung on better hinges. She thought about this one afternoon while hauling water, 2 successful trips to the spring and back, the ash path well worn now under her boots, and she tried to identify what exactly had changed, and the nearest she could get to it was this. In Silver Hollow, her value had always been calculated against things she couldn't control. Her father's name, her mother's death, the money lost in a mine that had never produced anything. Up here, her value was calculated against what she actually did. Every day. It was simple and it was hard, and she found an enormous relief. She came back into the cabin and set the buckets down and found Gideon sitting at the table looking at a piece of paper with the expression of a man working through something difficult. "What is it?" she asked. He looked up, held out the paper. She took it. It was a letter, or the start of one, only a few lines written in his careful and somewhat laborious hand. He wrote the way he talked, economically, choosing words like he was paying for each one. The letter was addressed to a trading company in Denver, and from what she could read, he was negotiating a supply arrangement. But something in the language was off. Too blunt, the kind of blunt that would close doors rather than open them. She looked at him. "This is for the spring supply?" "I need to establish a new arrangement. The man I was using retired." He paused. "I'm not good at this kind of writing." She read it again. "You're not wrong about the arrangement you want. The language is just..." She considered. "It reads like a demand. What you want is for them to want to do business with you." "I'm offering them money. They should want to do business with me." "They have other people offering them money," she said. "You need to give them a reason to prefer you." He looked genuinely puzzled by this, as if it had not occurred to him that commerce involved any dimension beyond the transaction itself. "What kind of reason?" "Reliability, volume, long-term relationship." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "May I?" He slid the paper across. She spent an hour on the letter, drafting and revising, asking him questions about the specifics of what he needed, and translating his flat functional answers into language that still said the same thing, but also said, "I am a serious man who will be a consistent customer, and it is worth your while to treat me well." She read the final version back to him. He listened carefully. "It says the same things," he said. "Yes, just..." She paused. "More usefully." He was quiet for a moment. "You're good at that, reading what people need to hear." "I spent 3 years dealing with creditors," she said. "You learn." He took the letter back and read it himself slowly, and she could see him weighing it against his original, comparing the content. Then he looked up. "Where did you learn to write like this?" "My mother. She was educated better than most women in this territory. Her father believed in it. She taught me." She paused. "I used to help my father with his correspondence, before everything. He was better at talking than writing." "Most people are," Gideon said. "You're better at doing than either," she said. Something in his expression shifted, that quick internal movement she'd seen before, too fast to identify. Is that a criticism? No, she said, and meant it. It's an observation. You communicate through what you do. It's just a different language. He looked at her steadily. You understand it, he said. Not a question, a recognition. I'm learning it, she said. He picked up the revised letter and folded it carefully and set it aside for copying to a clean sheet. Then he said, without looking up, the shelving in the root cellar. You said you could build it. I can. There's timber in the barn left from last summer, and the tools are on the east wall. He paused. If you want to start on it next week, before the worst of January sets in. All right, she said. I'll show you how I want it sized, for the jars. I'd rather measure myself, she said, and plan it. You can tell me afterward if it's wrong. He considered this for a moment. Fine, he said. She built the shelving over 4 days in the second week of January, when the temperature outside dropped to a level that made outdoor work a question of actual survival, and indoor projects suddenly became attractive. She measured twice, cut once. Her father, who had not been useful in most practical ways, had at least known that much about woodworking, and built the shelves in sections that could be assembled in the root cellar's tight space. On the fourth day, Gideon came down the root cellar steps and stood and looked at what she'd built. She stood back and let him look. It was good work. Not perfect. One join was slightly off true in a way that didn't affect the function. And she knew it was good work, and she waited for whatever he was going to say about it. Better than what I would have built, he said. She blinked. She hadn't expected that. The spacing is better, he continued, examining the shelves with the same attention he brought to everything. I would have done it wrong for the tall jars. I always do it wrong for the tall jars, and then I'm moving things around. He ran his hand along the edge of one shelf, testing it. This is solid. The one on the far left is slightly off, she said. Second join. I see it. He looked at it. Does it matter? For the function, no. For my peace of mind, a little. Something happened on his face. Definitive this time. A smile. Real one. Small and brief and slightly asymmetrical, like his face had forgotten how to do it and was working from old memory. It was gone almost immediately. But she'd seen it. She filed it carefully, the way she was filing all of these things, building a picture of him the way you build a picture of country, your mapping. One survey at a time, patience and precision, the accumulating knowledge of someone who is not passing through. Later that week she found, on the table beside the basin where she washed her hands each morning, a small jar of the bear-fat salve. It wasn't there at night, and it was there in the morning. He'd left it without mentioning it. She put it on her hands. They had healed enough that the cracks no longer bled, but they were still rough and tight, and the salve helped. She didn't thank him again because she understood by now that acknowledgement of that kind made him uncomfortable. Instead, when she put together his pack the following day, he was doing a half-day checking his trap lines, the first since her arrival. She included the heavier gloves she'd found in the storage room and resoled with a strip of leather she'd cut from a worn saddle. She didn't say she'd fix them, she just put them in the pack. He came back that evening and set his pack down and went about the business of coming in from cold. The ritual of it. Coat, boots, the checking of himself for frostbite that she'd learned he did automatically. A practiced inventory of extremities. Then he stopped and looked at his gloves. She was at the stove and didn't turn around. Eleanor. There's venison stew, she said. It needs another 20 minutes. A pause. Thank you, he said. For the gloves. They fit better now? Yes. Another pause. How did you do the sole? Saddle leather from that broken one in the barn. The stitching is a bit rough. I don't have the right needle. I'll get one from town when I go in spring. He hung the gloves up and came to the fire and stood near it, working, feeling back into his hands in the way he always did. You don't have to do things like that, he said. That's not part of the arrangement. She turned around and looked at him. I know, she said. I did it anyway. He looked at her. The firelight moved across his face, finding the angles of it. Why? He said. She turned back to the stove. Because your hands are as important up here as mine. And because I can. She stirred the stew. And because it wasn't much trouble. He was quiet behind her for a long moment. The arrangement, he said slowly, like he was examining the word. It's not. He stopped. Started again. I've been thinking that arrangement was the wrong word for what this is. She kept stirring. What would be the right word? I don't know, he said. I'm still working that out. She said nothing. The stew simmered. Outside, the dark had come fully down and the temperature was dropping in the particular way of clear winter nights, fierce and clean. The stars coming out above the peaks with a brightness that still caught her off guard when she looked at them. She'd been here almost 6 weeks and the sky still surprised her. Do you regret it? He asked, quietly, from behind her. She thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to think about things up here, without the automatic performance of an emotion that was expected, without defaulting to whatever answer would make the other person comfortable. She thought about the barn in Silver Hollow, the cornbread she hadn't tasted, Agnes Porter's careful cruelty. She thought about the cold house, the silence, the identical days. Then she looked around the cabin, the shelving she'd built, the Shakespeare on the shelf, the ash lines on the path, the list on the wall near the door growing longer, both their handwriting on it. No, she said. I don't regret it. She heard him shift, the sound of him sitting down at the table, the familiar creak of the chair. Good, he said, simple, direct, like everything he said. She set 2 bowls on the table and sat across from him, and they ate the stew, which had come out better than she'd expected. The venison tender enough, the broth rich. The fire worked behind her. The wind tried the walls and found nothing. Neither of them spoke for a while, and it was the best kind of silence. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who don't need to say it. She thought, I don't know what this is becoming, but it is becoming something. Then she thought, one thing at a time. She picked up her spoon and ate her stew and let that be enough. February came in mean. Eleanor had learned by then to read the mountain's moods the way you learn to read a difficult person. Not perfectly, not without error, but well enough to know when something was building. The week before the storm, she felt it in the air, that particular pressure, a heaviness that settled into the valley like something with weight. The horses were restless 2 days before it hit. The temperature dropped in a way that felt less like cold and more like warning. She told Gideon. How long do you think? He asked. Days, she said. Not hours. He looked at the sky in that way of his, the complete inventory of it, reading things she was still learning to read. Yes, he said. We need to move the wood. They spent 2 full days preparing. The wood came in first, as much as they could stack inside the cabin and the covered section of the barn, enough to last a week without going out. The animals were checked, the feed stores redistributed, so everything the livestock needed was accessible from inside the barn without crossing open ground. She reorganized the root cellar, brought the most needed things up into the cabin, checked every seal and every joint and every place where cold could find its way in. She mended a split in the barn wall with pitch and strips of hide that Gideon had cured the previous fall, working in the dim barn light with the horses watching her in the companionable way they'd developed over these weeks. The big bay. She'd started calling him Samuel, which Gideon had acknowledged with a look, but not contradicted, pressing his nose briefly against her shoulder before losing interest. Good boy, she told him, and meant it, and felt only a little foolish about it. Gideon was checking the trap lines that week. He'd been rotating them through the winter, running a circuit that took him out for stretches of hours, occasionally overnight when the lines were set at the far reaches of his territory. He knew these mountains the way she was only beginning to learn the homestead, bone deep, instinctive, a knowledge that had accumulated over years of the kind of sustained attention that leaves a mark on a person. He went out on a Thursday morning, the sky already carrying that yellow-gray quality that preceded serious weather. Eleanor watched him go from the cabin doorway, the familiar sight of him, big and dark against the white landscape, moving through snow with the long, efficient stride she'd cataloged now over weeks of watching. He had his rifle and his pack and his trapping tools, and he knew these mountains. She'd told herself that every time he went out, and it had always been sufficient because it had always been true. Back by dark, he said, before he left. He said this every time he went out. It was the closest thing to reassurance he offered, and she'd come to understand it as such. Be careful of the North Ridge, she said. It's been making noise. He paused. What kind of noise? settling. I heard it 2 nights ago. The cold contracts the rock. He considered this. I'll go around it. Then he was gone into the white. She worked through the morning, the bread she'd been developing. Trial and error. The sourdough starter she'd coaxed to life from flour and water and patience was finally producing something she was not embarrassed by. She baked, tended the fire, checked the barn at midday, mended a tear in the canvas covering the woodpile. The work had its own rhythm now, comfortable, hers in a way that had taken weeks to establish, and that she'd come to rely on. By early afternoon, the sky had changed, not gradually. That was the thing about mountain weather. It didn't always give you the slow announcement. 1 hour the yellow-gray was holding steady, and the next the clouds were moving with a purpose that made her stomach tighten. She went to the door and looked out and saw the darkness coming from the northwest like something deliberate. She checked the barn again, double-checked the feed, made sure every animal had water before it could freeze, came back inside and added wood to the fire and positioned more wood close to the stove. Then she stood at the window, the one that faced the direction Gideon would come from, and watched the storm come in. It hit around 3 in the afternoon. Not hard at first. The wind came first, the way it always did, rattling the shutters and working the door against its latch. Then the snow came sideways, which was a different thing entirely from snow that fell. Snow that had intention and velocity and reduced visibility to nearly nothing within 20 minutes. Dark came early. She lit the lanterns, fed the fire, made coffee that she didn't particularly want, and sat at the table and listened to the storm press itself against the cabin with a force that would have frightened her 3 months ago and now only made her careful. He should have been back. She knew the terrain well enough by now to estimate, if he was at the near trap lines, 2 hours. If he'd gone to the middle ones, 3. The far lines were a full day, but he didn't do those alone in winter, or at least he told her he didn't. She calculated and recalculated, and the math kept coming out the same. He should have been back before the storm hit, and the storm had been hitting for 2 hours. She did not panic. She made herself not panic by making her body do things. More wood on the fire, water heated on the stove. The lamp in the window turned up as high as it would go, which was a practical action and also something else, something that had no practical name. She checked the barn at 4:30, fighting the wind to get the door open, the snow driving against her face with a pain that was past cold and into something else. The animals were settled, huddled together in the animal way that distributed warmth. She talked to them for a few minutes, more for herself than for them, and came back in. By 5, she was walking the length of the cabin. 12 steps one way, 12 steps back. She made herself stop because it wasn't useful. She sat down and picked up the Shakespeare and stared at the page and read the same line 4 times without it meaning anything. She thought about what he'd told her in the first week, about the wagon going over. You can't stay where you are. You can't leave things half done. You get up and you figure out the next thing. She thought, I don't know what the next thing is if something has happened to him. She didn't complete that thought. She put it down and kept it down. At 5:43, she knew the time because she'd been watching the clock with the obsessive attention of someone who has nothing to do but wait. The cabin door burst open. Not the careful, managed opening of a person returning home. It flew back on its hinges with a force that wasn't entirely the wind and hit the inside wall and let in a wall of cold and snow and dark. And Gideon. He was standing in the doorway, and for 1 second she didn't understand what she was seeing because he was standing and she'd been building scenarios in which he wasn't, and her mind was slow to revise. Then she saw his left arm, the way he was holding it against his side with his right hand, the dark that was on his coat that was not shadow and not mud. She was across the room before she'd decided to move. Inside, she said. Come inside right now. He moved, which was good. She would later understand how significant it was that he was still moving under his own power. And she got the door shut behind him and turned and looked at him in the full lantern light and made herself do it without flinching. His coat was torn from the left shoulder down to the elbow, not cleanly, in the way that something with considerable force and something sharp had made contact. Through the tear, she could see the shirt beneath was dark with blood, soaked through, and the blood was still moving, which meant the wound was still open and active. His face was very white, which on a man of his complexion took some doing. Sit down, she said. Sit down, Gideon. He sat in the chair she pulled out for him. the motion careful and controlled, but she could see the control it required, the way he braced himself against the table edge. "Wolf," he said, "caught in a trap. I was trying to release it, and it—" He stopped. She could see him doing the same thing she'd done earlier, making his body remain managed when it wanted to do otherwise. "It was a big one. I didn't see how big." She was already working on the coat, the buttons, pulling it off his shoulder with care, but also with the speed the situation required. He winced once, sharply, when the torn section came away from the wound. The fabric had partially adhered where the blood had begun to dry at the edges, and she said nothing and kept working. The shirt beneath was a loss. She cut it with the knife she kept on the shelf. She'd started keeping it there after the second week, within reach of the table, a practical habit, cutting up the sleeve and across the shoulder so she could see what she was dealing with without moving him more than necessary. She looked at it. 3 lacerations across the shoulder and upper arm, one of them deep, the other 2 serious but less so. The deep one was the problem. It was still bleeding steadily, not pulsing, which meant he'd been lucky about the artery question, but steadily was bad enough over time and distance and cold. The edges of it were ragged in the way of a tearing injury rather than a cutting one. "How far were you?" she asked. She was moving to the shelf where she kept the medical supplies. She'd inventoried them in her first week and reorganized them in the second, and she knew exactly where everything was now, which was something she was fiercely grateful for at this moment. "An hour," he said. "Maybe more. I packed it with snow for the bleeding and kept moving." "Snow?" She said this with a flatness that expressed her opinion without requiring elaboration. "It was what I had." "I know." She brought the supplies to the table: clean cloth, the carbolic acid that was their best option for infection, the needle and thread that she'd put in the medical kit on her own initiative in the first month because the kit had been missing them, the bottle of whiskey from the back shelf that she'd known about and never touched. She set everything on the table in the order she would need it. She'd never done this before. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, to not perform a confidence she didn't have. She had cleaned and dressed wounds. Her own, her mother's, the ordinary injuries of a life that didn't include much help from others. She had not stitched a wound. She had watched a doctor do it once, on a ranch hand who'd come off a horse badly when she was perhaps 14 years old. She remembered the motion. She remembered what mattered. "This is going to be bad," she told him. Not an apology, a preparation. "I know," he said. His voice was steady, which cost him something. She could see it costing him. "Drink some of this first." She handed him the whiskey. He looked at it. "I don't drink." She looked at him. "Tonight you do." A pause. He took the bottle and drank, once, twice, 3 times, methodical, like everything he did, applying the required dose rather than seeking the relief of it. He handed it back. "More," she said. He looked at her. "Eleanor, you are going to sit still while I stitch that wound closed, Gideon, and you are going to need something to hold on to while I do it. Drink more." He drank more. She washed her hands, cleaned the wound as thoroughly as she could. The carbolic acid went on first, and he made a sound through his teeth that was the most expressive thing she'd heard from him in 2 months, a short, controlled sound that told her everything about how much it cost him to make even that much sound in front of another person. She kept moving. Clean cloth, pressure on the deep laceration until the bleeding slowed enough to work with. "Talk to me," she said, while she was threading the needle. Her hands were steady. She was grateful for her hands. "About what?" "Anything. Tell me about the wolf." A pause. He was looking at the far wall, which she understood was him choosing a point to fix on. "Gray wolf," he said. "Female. Big. Bigger than most I've seen in this range. She'd been in the trap a while, I could tell. Long enough to be—" He stopped. "Desperate," Eleanor said. "Yes." Another pause. "I was going to release her. I wasn't going to— She was going to live. That was the plan. I miscalculated the angle." She began the stitching. She'd been right. He went rigid against the table edge, and his hand gripped the wood with a force that was going to leave marks, but he didn't move. He made no sound at all, which she found almost harder to witness than if he'd cried out, the enormous controlled effort of it. "The wolf," she said. "Then what?" Then she was gone. His voice was tighter now, the effort of maintaining it audible. She ran north, toward the ridge line, a pause that was mostly him managing something internal. She'll be all right if she can find her pack. Wolves heal fast if they have the pack. She kept working. The deep laceration took 7 stitches. She wasn't entirely satisfied with the first 2. Too loose, she adjusted. And the others she got right. The work was precise and slow, and she gave it the full attention it required, blocking out everything that wasn't the needle and the wound and the knowledge she was working from. When she was done, she dressed it. Clean cloth, bound firmly without cutting off circulation, the same way she'd learned to wrap her own hands in those first weeks. She sat back and looked at what she'd done. It would hold. The stitching was uneven in places, not a doctor's work, but it was functional, and the wound was closed and the bleeding had stopped. She would watch for fever. She would change the dressing twice a day and watch the wound for the red lines that meant infection had set in, and hope to whatever was listening that it hadn't. Gideon looked down at the dressing, then at her. "That's good work," he said. "It'll do," she said. "No." His voice was different. Not soft exactly, but without the usual management of it, the edges slightly dissolved by pain and whiskey, and 2 hours of pushing through a blizzard with a wolf laceration, and enough blood loss to make a person reconsider their plans. "It's good work, Eleanor. I've had worse done by men who called themselves doctors." She looked at him. His face was still white, but the quality of it had changed. Not the white of blood loss in progress, but the white of exhaustion, the color that comes after the immediate crisis is past. His eyes, in the lantern light, were very direct. The usual self-containment was still there, but the walls of it were thinner. "You need to get warm," she said, "and you need to eat something." "I'm not hungry." "That's the blood loss talking. You need to eat anyway." She made him something simple. Bread and the remaining stew from earlier, heating it over the fire while he sat at the table, and she thought she could actually see him trying to decide whether to keep being stoic about everything or whether tonight was a night for different rules. He was a man who did not readily allow himself to be cared for. She understood that about him in the same way she understood the other things, through accumulated evidence, through pattern. She set the food in front of him and sat down across from him and ate her own portion because it would be easier for him to eat if she was eating rather than watching him do it. Outside, the storm was at full force now. The wind hitting the cabin in gusts that made the logs creak and the fire shift in the stove. The world beyond the walls was complete white chaos. In here it was warmth and lamplight and 2 people across a table and the ordinary sound of spoons on bowls. After a while he said, "You didn't panic." "No." "Why not?" She considered the question seriously. "I don't know," she said. "I've found that panic is loudest right before you need to act. If you start acting, it gets quieter." He looked at her. "Where did you learn that?" 3 years of being the only person who was going to handle a problem," she said. "If I panicked, nobody else was going to step in. So I just stopped and did what needed doing." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her in that way of his that she had come to think of as his reading the terrain look. The full attention without apology for it. "The widow from Alamosa," he said. "Ruth, when she got sick, a bad fever, in her 2nd month here, she asked me to take her down the mountain immediately, in the middle of winter." Eleanor waited. The pass wasn't safe. 2 days of hard weather, the road wasn't passable. "I told her we had to wait 2 days and I would take care of her here." He paused. "She thought I didn't care. That I was choosing the mountain over her. That's when things broke, I think. Whatever was going to work between us." "Did you explain?" "I tried. I'm not—" He stopped. "I explained it the way I explain most things, which is like giving someone a map and expecting them to navigate it themselves." He looked at the table. "She needed me to sit with her and say I was frightened too, and I couldn't do that." "Were you frightened?" "Yes," he said, simply. "Are you frightened now?" she asked. A pause. "My arm could go wrong," he said. "Infection. I've seen it happen." He said this with the same matter-of-factness he brought to most things, but underneath it she heard what it was. Not denial of the fear, but a man trying to be honest about something he wasn't practiced at. "I know," she said. "I'm going to watch it. We change the dressing in the morning and look for signs. If it's clean in 3 days, we're past the worst of it. And if it's not clean, then we deal with that when it comes." She met his eyes. You told me once, you can't stay where you are. You can't leave things half done. You get up and you figure out the next thing. Something crossed his face, recognition maybe, or something more complicated. You remembered that, he said. I remember most of what you tell me, she said. He was quiet. The fire shifted. The storm hit the north wall in a gust that was loud enough to interrupt any conversation less grounded than the one they were having, and neither of them flinched. She stood to clear the dishes, and he reached out with his right hand and caught her wrist. Not hard, just enough to stop her. And she went still. I need to say something, he said. She waited. He looked at the table first, gathering words the way he gathered other things, methodically, selecting what was necessary. Then he looked up at her. I brought you here because I thought I was solving a practical problem, he said. The homestead needed someone capable, and you needed somewhere to be, and the arrangement made sense on paper. A pause. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth of why. Eleanor was very still. When I walked into that barn, he said, I watched for 20 minutes before I walked across the room. And I watched a lot of people in those 20 minutes. The men who wouldn't cross the floor to talk to you. The women who were talking about you. The ones who knew you and looked away. He paused. And you. I watched you stand in the middle of all of it and not break. Not pretend it wasn't happening. Not perform some... He searched for words. Some dignity that was bigger than it was. You just stood there and took it and didn't fold. His voice was quiet, level, the words chosen with care. I've been places that would break most people, and I've met people who should have broken and didn't, and I know what that looks like. It looks like a person who has something real in them, something that's been tested and held. Eleanor's chest was doing something she couldn't fully manage. You saw all of that in 20 minutes, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. I pay attention, he said. You know that about me. I do, she said. His hand was still around her wrist, not gripping, just there, present. She was aware of it the way you become aware of things you hadn't accounted for. I don't know how to do this, he said. The admission cost him something. She could see it cost him. This is not something I have any experience with. The other thing, the thing that isn't arrangement or partnership. Neither do I, she said. Honestly, I've spent 3 years making sure I didn't need anyone. That doesn't make a person practiced at this. No, he said. So we're both bad at it, she said. His mouth moved, that small, asymmetric, almost smile that she'd cataloged, that she'd been watching for. It appears so. She looked at him. At this man who lived in mountains because the world below demanded too much of him in the wrong ways, who communicated through actions rather than words, and was sitting here trying to find words anyway, who had a wolf laceration on his arm and 2 months of her shelving in his root cellar, and her handwriting on a list by the door, and her Shakespeare on his shelf. She turned her wrist slowly until his hand fell away, and then she put her hand over his, briefly, a direct and deliberate thing. Get some sleep, she said. I'll sit up for a while and watch the fire. You don't need to. Gideon, she said it firmly. You've lost blood and you're running on whiskey and stubbornness and you need to sleep. I'll be right here. He looked at her for a long moment. You're going to do it anyway, he said. Yes. Even if I argued, especially then, he made that sound again. The short, dry, reluctant laugh that she'd been collecting since the first night. He stood, carefully, and she watched him do it with the monitoring attention she was going to give everything about him for the next 3 days, whatever he chose about that. He stopped at the door to the back room and looked at her. Eleanor. Yes. Thank you, he said, for... He seemed to consider whether he was going to say the full thing, and then he did, which she understood was not easy for him. For not being frightened, for being exactly who you are. She looked at him across the warm cabin, the storm working itself into the walls, the fire throwing its light. Go sleep, she said, and her voice only caught a little. He went. She sat down in the chair nearest the fire and pulled her mother's shawl around her shoulders and watched the flames and listened to the storm that was doing its worst outside and finding, as it had found every night since she arrived, that the walls held. Her hands, in the lamplight, were steady. She thought about what he'd said, exactly who you are. and tried to remember the last time anyone had said anything like that to her. She couldn't remember. Maybe her mother in the last years before the sickness. Maybe never in quite that way, in the way that meant the person had looked at you fully. The inconvenient parts, and the difficult parts, and the parts that didn't fit anyone's story about you, and had chosen all of it anyway. The fire settled. The storm pressed. She sat and kept watch. Outside, the mountain endured the way mountains do, without drama, without complaint, simply by being what it was, which was more than enough. The wound stayed clean. Eleanor checked it every morning for 6 days with the same focused attention she'd brought to stitching it, unwrapping the dressing carefully, looking for the red lines that would mean infection had traveled, the heat and swelling that would mean something worse was happening underneath. Each morning, the wound looked a little less angry. Each morning, she rewrapped it without comment, and Gideon received this without comment, and they both moved through the day carrying the knowledge that they had come close to something serious and had come through it, and neither of them made a production of that fact. He was a bad patient. She'd expected that. He pushed his arm too early, trying to resume full work on the 3rd day, and she came into the barn and found him attempting to shift a feed sack that weighed more than was reasonable given the circumstances. And she took it out of his hands without asking and moved it herself and said, evenly, 3 more days, and walked out. He followed her back into the cabin and said, I'm not incapacitated. And she said, I know that, and in 3 days you can prove it. And he stood there for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating and then went and sat down. She considered that a victory of some significance. On the 7th morning, she unwrapped the dressing and looked at the wound and said, It's closing well. You're past it. He looked at the stitching, her stitching, uneven in places but holding, and then at her. You did that, he said. We both got through it, she said. He shook his head slightly. No, you did that. He said it the way he said most important things, quietly and without decoration. I want you to know I understand that. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. I'll accept that. The storm had passed after 3 days, leaving the valley buried under more snow than she'd seen since arriving, the drifts against the north wall of the cabin chest high, the landscape rearranged into shapes she had to relearn. They dug out together on the 4th day, Gideon with his good arm doing more than she'd have preferred, Eleanor compensating by working until her shoulders burned, and restored order to the homestead by degrees. The animals were fine. The structures had held. The shelving in the root cellar was intact, every jar where she'd placed it. Small things. They added up to something that felt larger than their individual parts. February gave way to March. And March was not spring, not up here, but it was different from February. The light changed first, arriving earlier and staying longer, and the quality of it changed too, from the flat gray of deep winter to something with more angle to it, more intention. She started noticing it around the 3rd week of March, standing in the yard after the morning chores and feeling the sun on her face with actual warmth behind it. She stood there with her eyes closed for a moment, just that, just the sun on her face after months of cold. Gideon came out of the barn and stopped and watched her do it. She knew he was watching. She could feel it, had developed some sense of him in space that she hadn't consciously cultivated but that existed anyway. And she didn't open her eyes immediately. Just let the moment be what it was. March is lying, he said. It'll go cold again. I know, she said, and kept her face turned up. I'm enjoying the lie. She heard him make the sound, the short, dry, almost laugh, and then the creak of his boots on the snow as he came to stand beside her, and for a minute or two they both stood in the yard with the sun on them and said nothing. It was the most peaceful she'd felt since arriving. Maybe longer than that. Then things between them had shifted after the night of the storm. Not dramatically. Nothing between them was dramatic, which she had come to appreciate as one of his better qualities, but perceptibly. The walls that had always been present in him, not hostile walls, but functional ones, the kind a person builds when they've spent years learning that the interior is safer than the exterior, had developed a different quality. They were still there. They would probably always be there in some form, but there were doors in them now. He opened them selectively, briefly, and then closed them again, and she didn't push, didn't put her foot in the door to keep it open. She waited for the next time. He started talking more. Not a lot. He was not and would not become a man of many words, but more than before, and about different things. One evening, he told her about the first winter he'd spent in the high mountains, at 23, without proper preparation, how close it had actually come before he'd understood what the cold required of a person. He told it matter-of-factly, without drama, but she understood it was a story he didn't tell often, one that cost something to tell because it involved being young and wrong and frightened. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Not unkindly, genuinely wanting to know. He thought about it. "Because you should know that I was bad at this once," he said. "Before I was good at it. People see what I am now and think it was always this way." "Nobody is always anyway," she said. "No," he agreed. "But some people make it look like they were." She understood what he was doing, dismantling something, deliberately, the mythology that had built up around him the way mythology builds up around solitary, capable men in territories where stories are the primary entertainment. He was telling her who he actually was, underneath the legend. It was, she thought, an act of considerable trust for a man who trusted carefully. She met it with her own. She told him about the year after her father died, the one she'd never described fully to anyone. Not the version she'd given the creditors, or the version she'd given Martha, or even the version she'd told herself. The real year, the one where there had been a period of perhaps 2 months during which she had genuinely not known if she was going to be all right, if the particular weight of all of it was going to be more than she could hold up. She told him about the morning she'd sat on the kitchen floor of the cold, empty house, the furniture burned, most of the useful things sold, and had stayed on that floor for an hour because she didn't see the point of getting up. "But you got up," he said. "Eventually." She paused. "I got up because I was hungry, which is not a very interesting reason." "It's the right reason," he said. "The body knows things before the mind does." She looked at him. "That's almost philosophical." "Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my reputation." She laughed, a real one, unguarded, and it surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. He watched her laugh with an expression that she didn't try to catalog because some things are better received than analyzed. April came, and with it, the first real signs of the world below reasserting itself. The passes became navigable again by mid-month, the snow receding from the lower elevations if not from the peaks, and the route to town opened up for the first time since November. Gideon came in one morning and said, "I need to go to town. Supplies. I'll be 3 days." Eleanor looked up from the mending she was doing, his second-best shirt, a tear at the shoulder seam that she'd been putting off. "All right," she said, "you'll be fine here." "I know." He looked at her. "I mean it. You know everything you need to know." "Gideon," she set the shirt down. "I'll be fine. Go." He went the next morning, early, before full light, with the bigger bay and a pack horse, and Eleanor stood in the yard and watched him go the same way she'd watched him leave for the trap lines all winter. And the feeling was the same and also different. The same because she tracked him until he disappeared into the trees and didn't look away until he had. Different because now she knew what 3 days felt like without him, and she had a more specific sense of what it was she'd be waiting for. She worked. She worked in the way she'd been working all winter, efficiently and without stopping until the light was gone. But something about working alone felt different now than it had in November. Then it had been the work of establishing herself, proving to herself and obliquely to him that she could manage it. Now it was just the work, hers. She knew the rhythm of the homestead intimately by this point, every system and every quirk and every place where things needed watching. She moved through it with the ease of someone who has stopped thinking about each action and started simply doing. On the second day alone, she found the letter. It was in the pocket of her coat, her town coat, the one she'd worn to Silver Hollow and had barely used since. She was going through the storage room looking for something else entirely and came across the coat and checked the pockets from habit and found a folded piece of paper she didn't remember putting there. She opened it, Martha Gaines's handwriting. A note she must have pressed into Eleanor's coat pocket on that last night in the barn, in the confusion of departing, in the moment when everyone was processing what was happening. Eleanor hadn't found it then and hadn't found it in the weeks after because she'd had no occasion to wear the coat. She sat down on a crate in the storage room and read it. "Eleanor, I am sorry I said the things I said. I am sorry for all of it, for talking you into going and then not saying a word when I should have said something. I should have said a great deal. You have always been the best of us, and I have not always acted like I knew that. I hope the mountain is kind to you. I hope you find what you went looking for, even if you didn't know you were looking for it. Write when you can. Your friend Still, if you'll have me. M. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time. She read it twice more. She thought about Martha, who had a good heart and was limited by it in the way that good-hearted people sometimes are. Limited by the need for everyone to be all right, for the story to end neatly, which sometimes made her useless in the middle of things, even though she was genuinely sorry afterward. She wasn't angry. She'd thought she might be, if she ever found such a note, but the anger had apparently done its work without her noticing and was gone. And what was left was something more tired and more tender, the residue of a long friendship that had failed at a particular moment and might yet continue. She would write to Martha. Not yet. When she had the words right, she folded the letter carefully and put it in the small box where she kept her mother's shawl and the $17 and the other things that mattered. Gideon came back on the afternoon of the third day, which was when he'd said he'd come back. She was in the yard splitting wood. She'd gotten genuinely good at it by now, the motion efficient, the rhythm established. And she heard the horses on the lower track and stopped and waited. He came into the yard and looked at the wood she'd split and then at her. "You've been busy," he said. "3 days," she said. "What took you so long?" Something shifted on his face. "I had business," he said. He dismounted and tied the horses and began unpacking the pack horse with his usual efficiency. And she came to help and they worked in comfortable parallel, the familiar rhythm of it. Then he handed her a letter. She took it, looked at the handwriting on the front, a name she'd written to 3 times and never received an answer from. A name that had sat in her accounting for 2 years. "Aldrich," she said. "He's alive. His wife was sick, long illness. He hasn't been managing correspondence." Gideon paused. "He asked me to tell you the debt is forgiven, that he'd say so in writing if you needed it." She looked at the letter. "I have $17 set aside." "I know." A pause. "He doesn't want it. He said, and I'm telling you this the way he said it, so you understand it's his words, not mine. He said any woman who spent 3 years trying to pay a dead man's debts has paid enough." Eleanor stood in the April sunlight with the letter in her hands and felt something she didn't have a precise name for. Not relief exactly, because she'd learned to live with the weight of it and had stopped expecting it to lift. Something more like the absence of a sound you've been hearing so long you stop knowing it was there, and then it stops, and the quiet is startling. "Are you all right?" Gideon asked. "Yes," she said. "I just need a moment." He gave her one. That was something she'd learned about him. He gave people the moments they needed without filling them, without asking questions that would require her to manage his response to her response. She took the moment, breathed in the April air, which was still cold but carrying something underneath the cold now, a suggestion of what was coming. The earth under the snow beginning to think about something other than winter. She looked at the peaks, still white, would be white for months yet. She looked at the homestead, the cabin, the barn, the smokehouse, the root cellar with her shelving, the ash lines on the path that were almost worn away now and would need refreshing. She looked at all of it and understood that at some point, without announcement, it had become hers. Not in any legal sense, that was a different and separate question, but in the way that a place becomes yours when you've put your work into it, when you've learned its rhythms and compensated for its deficiencies and survived it through its worst season. "I need to tell you something," she said. Gideon stopped unpacking and looked at her. "I came here because I had nowhere else," she said. "I want you to know I'm aware of that. I didn't come here because I was brave or because I saw some clear path to a better life. I came because the alternative was more of the same, and more of the same was going to make me into something I didn't want to become." She paused. "I'm telling you that because you said you wanted honesty, and I've been mostly honest, but I haven't said that particular thing." He was quiet for a moment. "Why are you saying it now?" "Because it matters," she said, "what we build from. And I don't want there to be something underneath all of this that neither of us is saying." He looked at her steadily. "Is there anything else underneath that you're not saying?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "That was it." "All right." He picked up a supply crate. "Then I'll tell you something I'm not saying." She waited. "I went to town," he'd said, moving toward the cabin door. "And every person I talked to asked me about you. not in a hostile way, in a, he paused, choosing words, curious way, like something had shifted and they were trying to understand what had shifted. He set the crate down inside and came back for another. Martha Gaines stopped me on the street and talked to me for 20 minutes about you, about what you were like when you were young, before everything happened with your father, the way you were back then. He said this without looking at her, occupying himself with the packing. The way she described you matched what I've been living with all winter. I thought you should know that someone down there remembers who you are outside of what happened to you. Eleanor's throat did something complicated. Martha always knew, she said. She wasn't always brave about it. No, he said. Most people aren't brave about the things they know. He straightened and looked at her. I have something else. He went to his saddlebag and came back with a small package wrapped in cloth. He held it out. She unwrapped it. A pair of proper needles for leatherwork, the kind she'd mentioned needing months ago, that she'd been compensating without. And beneath them, a book. New, spine uncracked, the cover a deep green. She turned it over. A collection of botanical illustrations of mountain plants, their uses, their seasons. She looked up at him. For the spring, he said, there are plants up here worth knowing. Medicine, food, the ones that are useful and the ones that will kill you if you eat them. He paused. I know most of them, but not all of them are in my head clearly. And I thought, you'd want to know for yourself rather than ask me every time. She understood what he was actually saying, not just the practical reason, which was real, but the other thing underneath it. He had gone to town and he had thought of her specifically, had thought about what she would want and what would be useful to her, and had made a choice that was not about supplies or practicality, but about something else, something they were both still finding words for. Thank you, she said. And then, because she was done with the kind of restraint that came from protection rather than choice, you know what this is, don't you? Between us. He was very still. I know what it's becoming, he said carefully. Is that all right with you? A long pause. The kind of pause he used when he was making sure he was going to say the true thing. Yes, he said. It is. Another pause. Is it all right with you? Yes, she said. They stood in the April yard with spring threatening underneath the cold and looked at each other, two people who had come to this from the most impractical directions imaginable and had found, through accumulated winter and work and the ordinary intimacy of daily survival, something that was not an arrangement anymore and had not been one for quite some time. He reached out and touched her face once, briefly, his scarred hand against her cheek, the gesture of someone who doesn't do this easily and is doing it anyway. And then dropped his hand and went back to unloading the horses, and she went to help him, and that was that. It was not a fairy tale moment. The horses needed seeing to, and the supplies needed putting away, and there was wood to split before dark. They worked side by side the way they'd been working all winter, and she thought, this is what it looks like, actually. This is what it actually looks like. Not sweeping and grand, just two people choosing each other in the space between one task and the next, in the ordinary time that most love actually lives in, far from the peaks of drama, in the flat, useful day-to-day of a life built together. Spring came fully in May. The snow pulled back from the lower slopes, and the valley floor began to show the gray-green of things waking up. And Eleanor went out with her new book and began to learn the plants the way she'd learned everything else up here, carefully, on her own terms, making notes in the margins. She wrote to Martha Gaines in May, a long letter, the kind she'd been composing in her head since October, honest about the winter, honest about what she'd found and what she'd let go. She didn't perform contentment. She described it plainly. The cold, the work, the fear during the storm, the strange education of being somewhere that didn't know or care about her father's name. She described Gideon in the careful way you describe someone who now occupies the interior of your life, without overselling him, without sanding down the difficult parts. He is not easy, she wrote. Neither am I. That turns out to be fine. Martha wrote back in June, and the letter was 3 pages and mostly apology, some of it genuine and some of it the performance of apology, and Eleanor read all of it with the patience she'd developed for things that weren't quite right but were offered sincerely, and she wrote back again, and they continued, which was what friendship was. The continuation, through imperfection, by choice. In July, a trader came through the valley, one of the few people who came this high, a weathered man named Peterson who made a circuit through the territory twice a year and who had, over years, become something like a connection to the lower world for Gideon. He spent one night at the homestead and left in the morning with the news that always traveled with him, the currency of distant events translated into the language of this particular altitude. On his way out, he stopped and looked at the homestead with the eyes of someone who had seen it before and was seeing it differently. "It's changed," he said to Gideon, but loudly enough that Eleanor nearby could hear. "Some," Gideon said. Peterson looked at Eleanor, who was doing something practical with a fence post. "You built those shelves in the root cellar?" he asked her. "Yes." "And the barn wall?" "The eastern section, yes." He nodded slowly, the nod of someone updating their records. "I'll tell people in town," he said. She looked at him. "Tell them what?" He seemed to consider this. "That the Wolf place is prospering," he said, "and that it's got 2 people running it now." He said this simply, without agenda, and went on his way. Eleanor watched him go and thought about Silver Hollow, about the barn, about Agnes Porter's careful suggestion that she leave. She thought about what it must look like from down there. The woman nobody had wanted, living on the most productive homestead in the high territory, beside a man who had walked past every admired woman in a room to stand in front of her. She thought about what the town would do with that story, which was probably what towns always do. Reshape it, make it fit, turn it into the version that confirms what they already believe. She found she didn't particularly care what version they made, because she knew the actual version, which was not the one where she'd been saved by a man who'd seen her worth. The actual version was the one where 2 people who had both built walls against the world had, through the slow accumulation of winter and work and honesty, found that it was possible to build something else. Not instead of the walls, exactly, but alongside them. There's a particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It's not the strength of people who have never been tested or never been hurt. It's the other kind, the kind that comes from having been knocked down and having gotten up not because the situation improved, but because staying down was simply not something you were willing to do. Eleanor had that kind of strength. So did Gideon, in his own way, built up over years of a different kind of solitude. They recognized it in each other before they recognized anything else, which was maybe why everything else followed. She thought about what her mother used to call her good-bad quality. The part that wouldn't let go. The part that kept standing, kept paying back debts that weren't fully hers, kept her chin up in a barn full of people who had decided what she was worth and been wrong about it. She used to think of it as stubbornness, which is what people call persistence, in someone they'd prefer would give up. Now she thought of it differently. Not as a virtue exactly, nothing so clean as that. Just a fact of her. A thing she was, that had brought her here, that was building something. By late summer, the homestead was genuinely flourishing in ways that went beyond simple survival. The food stores were fuller than they'd been in Gideon's previous years. Her organization, her additions to the root cellar, the garden she'd started in a south-facing pocket that got enough sun to grow the hardier vegetables through the shortened mountain season. The animals were well, the barn solid, the smokehouse sealed properly at last. And one evening in August, sitting on the steps of the cabin after the day's work was done, watching the light come off the peaks in the way it did at this hour, amber and extravagant, the mountains showing off in the way they occasionally did, as if they remembered that beauty was also part of what they were, Gideon sat down beside her and said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment in his particular way, the interior gathering. "I want this to be permanent," he said. "Legally, formally, not arrangement, not partnership." He paused. I don't know how to ask this the way it's supposed to be asked." "You're asking it the way you ask things," she said. "That's fine. Is that a yes?" She looked at the mountains, at the light on the peaks, at the valley that was hers now, in the way that places become yours. She thought about the barn in Silver Hollow one last time, gave it that, a last thought, and then let it go. It had made her who she was, and it was over. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, a small, careful sound. Then he reached over and took her hand and held it, and they sat on the steps of the cabin they'd built together, in the mountains that didn't care about either of them but were magnificent anyway, and watched the light do what August light does in the high Rockies, which is burn gold and then go slowly, slowly dark. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was nothing that needed saying that hadn't already been said, and nothing that needed doing that the morning wouldn't bring. They had learned between them the difference between silence that was empty and silence that was full, and this was the fullest kind, the kind that only exists when two people have been honest enough with each other that the quiet between them is not a gap but a foundation. The stars came out, more of them than you ever see from a town. Eleanor Cross, who would be Eleanor Wolfe by fall, though she'd keep both names, which Gideon accepted without discussion because it made practical sense and also because he understood it mattered, sat in the dark with her hand in his and looked up at the sky that she had come to know over the course of one long, hard, irreplaceable winter, and thought, this is what it means to be somewhere, not just passing through, not just surviving, somewhere. The mountains stood around them, patient and immense and indifferent in the way that, she'd learned, was not the same as unkind. It didn't offer anything. It didn't promise anything. It simply was, exactly what it was. And it had required her to be exactly what she was in return. That was the deal, no more, no less. She had held up her end.